Hidden within the pages of an ancient text lies the most detailed account of biblical events you've never been taught in Sunday school. The book of Jasher contains shocking revelations about Noah's Ark, Abraham's early life, and the untold stories of the patriarchs that will completely change how you view the Old Testament. But here's the controversial part. Nobody can definitively prove whether this book is authentic ancient scripture or one of history's most convincing religious hoaxes. Prepare to journey through thousands of years of mystery, controversy, and lost biblical history as we uncover the entire story of the book of Jasher. But before we dive in, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like and subscribe button if this type of content helps you learn something new. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The Lost Book. Deep in the pages of the Old Testament, there exists a mystery, a book that once was but now seems lost to time. The book of Jasher whispers to us from ancient verses, mentioned but not found, referenced but not present. Its very name carries weight. Jasher means the upright one in Hebrew, suggesting something pure, something true. Picture the scribes of old, their fingers tracing across parchment by candlelight. They knew this book. They quoted from it. They trusted its words enough to reference it in their sacred texts. Yet somewhere between then and now, it vanished like morning mist. The mystery deepens when we consider what we've lost. This wasn't just any book. It was significant enough to be cited in the most important religious texts of the ancient world. The writers of Joshua and 2 Samuel thought highly enough of Jasher to mention it by name. They expected their readers to know it, to have access to it. But what was it exactly? Some scholars believe it was a collection of ancient Hebrew poetry, celebrating the great heroes of Israel. Others think it contained historical records, preserved from the earliest days of human civilization. The truth remains hidden in the shadows of time. The name itself tells a story. Sefer HaYashar in Hebrew, the Book of the Upright. This suggests more than just a history book. It implies moral teaching, stories of righteous people, examples to follow. The ancient Hebrews valued righteousness above almost everything else, so a book earning this title would have been treasured. Consider the weight of what we're discussing. A text so important that biblical authors assumed their readers would know it. So trusted that they could reference it without explanation. So valuable that its loss created a gap that scholars have wondered about for centuries. The silence where Jasher should be speaks volumes. Libraries burned, scrolls crumbled, wars scattered precious texts to the winds, yet somehow, impossibly, the book of Jasher survived, or at least something claiming to be the book of Jasher emerged from the darkness of history. This emergence brings its own questions. When something is lost for centuries, then suddenly reappears, we must ask, is this truly what was lost, or something else entirely? The book we know today as Jasher tells stories that feel familiar yet strange, biblical yet different. The ancient world was rich with books that time has swallowed. Libraries in Alexandria, Babylon, and Jerusalem once held treasures we can barely imagine. The book of Jasher was among them, referenced, quoted, trusted. Then came the long silence. What makes this silence more haunting is that we know exactly where Jasher should have been mentioned. We can see the gaps where its wisdom would have fit perfectly. The biblical authors clearly expected their readers to turn to Jasher for more detail, for deeper understanding. This creates a unique situation in ancient literature. We have a ghost book, something we know existed because others spoke of it, but which we cannot read for ourselves. At least, we couldn't for many centuries. The mystery of its disappearance matches the mystery of its eventual return. The very fact that Jasher's name means upright suggests this wasn't just entertainment or even simple history. It was moral instruction, disguised as story. The ancient Hebrews were master storytellers, weaving truth into narrative, making lessons memorable through drama and character. So we begin our journey into the book of Jasher knowing we're entering disputed territory. We're exploring a text that may be ancient wisdom or medieval creation, authentic history, or inspired fiction. The mystery itself has become part of Jasher's power, drawing readers into questions that stretch back thousands of years. The search for truth about Jasher takes us through libraries and monasteries, through scholarly debates and religious controversies. It's a journey that mirrors the book's own strange path through time, appearing, disappearing, emerging again when least expected. Tonight, as we settle into this exploration, we're joining a conversation that has fascinated minds for centuries. The Book of Jasher challenges us to think about what we've lost, what we found, and what it means to rediscover something that was never supposed to be lost in the first place. The biblical mentions only 2 verses in the entire Bible mention the Book of Jasher directly, yet these brief references have sparked centuries of curiosity and debate. These mentions feel like whispers from the past, hints about a larger story that once existed, but now remains tantalizingly out of reach. The first mention appears in Joshua during one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history. Joshua is fighting the Amorites, and the sun stands still in the sky. This miracle is so extraordinary that the biblical author feels compelled to provide a source, and that source is the book of Jasher. The verse reads simply, "Is this not written in the book of Jasher?" Think about what that means. The writer of Joshua was describing an event so incredible that readers might doubt it, so he points them to another another book that apparently contained the same account. This suggests the book of Jasher was well known, trusted, and readily available to ancient readers. The second mention comes in 2 Samuel during David's lament for Saul and Jonathan. After their deaths in battle, David composes a beautiful, heartbreaking song of mourning. The text tells us this lament should be taught to the people of Judah and then adds, "Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher." Again, we see the same pattern. The biblical author assumes readers know about Jasher and can consult it for additional information. This wasn't a rare or mysterious text. It was apparently common enough that people could be expected to look things up in it. These references create a fascinating puzzle. If Jasher was so well known and trusted that biblical authors could cite it casually, why did it disappear? What happened to this book that once sat alongside the texts we now consider scripture? The context of these mentions makes them even more intriguing. Both references occur during moments of high drama, miraculous intervention, and profound grief. These weren't casual historical notes, but pivotal moments in Israel's story. The fact that Jasher is cited for both suggests it contained some of the most important stories in Hebrew tradition. Scholars have long debated what these references actually mean. Some believe Jasher was a book of poetry, specifically victory songs and laments. Others think it was a historical chronicle recording the great events of Israel's past. Still others suggest it might have been a collection of moral tales, stories designed to teach and inspire. The Hebrew phrase Sefer Hayashar could be translated in different ways. Book of the Upright is most common, but it could also mean Book of Songs or even Book of the Righteous Ones. Each translation suggests a different type of text, a different purpose. What's particularly striking is how confident the biblical authors sound when they reference Jasher. There's no hesitation, no qualification. They simply point readers to this other source as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This confidence suggests Jasher had established authority in ancient Jewish culture. The timing of these references also matters. Joshua was written during or shortly after the conquest of Canaan. 2 Samuel was composed during the monarchy period. This means Jasher was known and respected across different eras of Hebrew history, suggesting it had lasting importance. Some scholars wonder if these references might be later additions inserted by scribes who wanted to give their accounts more authority. But the references feel natural, integrated into the text rather than awkwardly inserted. They read like authentic citations by authors who genuinely expected their readers to know the source. The loss of Jasher becomes more poignant when we consider what these references suggest about ancient Hebrew literary culture. They had multiple sources, cross-references between texts, and expectations that educated readers would consult various books. This was a sophisticated literary environment, not the simple oral culture sometimes imagined. Both biblical references also suggest that Jasher contained more detail than the biblical accounts. The implication is that readers could turn to Jasher for fuller versions of these stories. This makes its loss even more significant. We've apparently lost the expanded versions of some of the Bible's most dramatic moments. The question of whether the book of Jasher we have today is the same one mentioned in the Bible becomes crucial here. If it is, then we have access to the expanded accounts these biblical authors expected their readers to consult. If it's not, then we're still left with the tantalizing mystery of what those original readers would have found. These two biblical mentions have taken on a life of their own, becoming the foundation for centuries of speculation and searching. They represent something precious that was lost, something important that slipped through the fingers of history. They remind us that our ancient texts are part of a larger conversation, one in which many voices have been silenced by time. The question of what the Book of Jasher actually is has no simple answer. Scholars have wrestled with this mystery for centuries, and their conclusions vary dramatically. Some see it as authentic ancient history, others as medieval fiction, and still others as something in between. A text that preserves genuine traditions, even if it's not historically accurate in every detail. The book we call Jasher today tells the story of the world from creation through the Exodus from Egypt. It reads like an expanded version of the first books of the Bible, filled with additional details, conversations, and episodes that don't appear in the canonical texts. The style is narrative, almost novelistic, bringing characters to life in vivid detail. What makes Jasher particularly interesting is how it handles familiar biblical stories. It doesn't contradict the Bible so much as expand on it, filling in gaps and providing backstory for events that are mentioned only briefly in Scripture. It's as if someone took the outline provided by Genesis and Exodus and fleshed it out into a full narrative. The Hebrew of Jasher is relatively straightforward, lacking the archaic forms we might expect from truly ancient texts. This has led some scholars to conclude that the current version was composed in medieval times, probably between 1000 and 1500 CE. Others argue that the language could have been updated over time while preserving ancient content. The question of authenticity becomes complex when we consider how texts were transmitted in the ancient world. Stories were told and retold, written and rewritten, translated and adapted. Even if the current book of Jasher isn't identical to the ancient text mentioned in the Bible, it might still preserve genuine traditions that go back thousands of years. Some of the stories in Jasher appear nowhere else in Jewish literature, yet they feel authentic to the ancient world. The book displays detailed knowledge of ancient customs, geography, and social practices. Either the author was remarkably well informed about ancient life, or the text really does preserve old traditions. The theological perspective of Jasher aligns closely with mainstream Jewish thought. It emphasizes God's sovereignty, human responsibility, and the importance of righteousness. The moral lessons embedded in the stories reflect the same values found throughout Jewish scripture and tradition. This consistency suggests the book emerged from within Jewish culture rather than being imposed from outside. What's particularly intriguing is how Jasher handles the relationship between divine action and human choice. The book shows God working through natural events and human decisions rather than relying on constant miraculous intervention. This sophisticated understanding of divine providence matches the theological thinking of educated Jewish writers across many centuries. The structure of Jasher also raises interesting questions. It follows biblical chronology closely, but expands certain episodes while condensing others. This selectivity suggests the author had specific purposes in mind, particular stories to tell and lessons to teach. It's not simply a longer version of the Bible, but a carefully crafted work with its own agenda. Archaeological evidence provides little help in resolving the authenticity question. The stories in Jasher take place in the ancient Near East, but so do many later fictional works. The fact that Jasher describes ancient customs accurately doesn't prove it's ancient. Medieval Jewish scholars were quite knowledgeable about biblical history and could have recreated authentic-sounding details. The manuscript tradition of Jasher adds another layer of complexity. The earliest complete manuscript we have dates to the 1600s, though fragments and references suggest earlier versions existed. This relatively late manuscript history raises questions about how much the text might have changed over time. Different communities have held varying views about Jasher's authenticity. Some Jewish scholars have embraced it as genuine ancient wisdom, while others have dismissed it as late fiction. Christian scholars have been similarly divided, with some seeing it as valuable historical background and others as potentially misleading. The book's claim to be the Book of Jasher, mentioned in the Bible, is itself problematic. There's no clear chain of transmission connecting the current text to the ancient one. The book simply presents itself as Jasher without providing evidence for this identification. This has led many scholars to conclude that the current text is a later work that borrowed the name of the lost ancient book. Yet the stories in Jasher have a power that transcends questions of historical authenticity. They provide rich psychological portraits of biblical characters, exploring their motivations and inner lives in ways that the laconic biblical texts rarely do. Whether ancient or medieval, Jasher offers compelling interpretations of familiar stories. Um, the question of what Jasher is ultimately depends on what we're looking for. If we want verified ancient history, the current text probably falls short. If we want insight into how Jewish storytellers understood their traditions, Jasher provides abundant material. If we want to understand how biblical stories were expanded and interpreted over time, Jasher is invaluable. Perhaps the most honest answer is that Jasher is a mystery, a text that preserves ancient traditions in a form that may be much later than the traditions themselves. It's a book that asks us to think carefully about the relationship between history and story, between fact and truth, between what happened and what it all means. The book resurfaces. After centuries of absence, the Book of Jasher made a remarkable return to the world stage in the 17th century. This reappearance was as mysterious as the book's original disappearance, raising questions that continue to puzzle scholars today. The story of how Jasher came back to light reads like a detective novel, complete with obscure manuscripts, scholarly debates, and claims that couldn't be verified. The first European to encounter Jasher was a scholar named Alcuin, who claimed to have found a Hebrew manuscript in a library in Toledo, Spain. Toledo was a center of Jewish learning before the expulsion of 1492, and its libraries had preserved many ancient texts. According to Alcuin's account, he discovered the manuscript among other Hebrew works and recognized its significance. But Alcuin's story has problems. No independent verification exists for his claims, and the manuscript he supposedly found has never been located. Some scholars believe Alcuin may have been the actual author of the Jasher text, creating it himself and then claiming to have discovered it. Others think he might have found a genuine medieval Hebrew work and mistakenly identified it as the ancient Book of Jasher. The plot thickens when we consider that multiple versions of Jasher appeared around the same time in different parts of Europe. Some were in Hebrew, others in Latin translation. These versions differed in details but shared the same basic structure and story. This suggests either a common source or coordinated effort to create the texts. The Hebrew version that became most widely known was published in Venice in 1625. The publisher claimed it was translated from an ancient manuscript, but provided no details about where the manuscript came from or who had possessed it. This lack of provenance troubled scholars even at the time, but the book's content was so compelling that it found readers despite these concerns. What made the situation even more complicated was the appearance of a completely different book, also claiming to be the Book of Jasher. This second text, known as the Pseudo-Jasher, contained different stories and had a different style. It was clearly a separate work, yet it made the same claim to ancient authenticity. The existence of two competing books of Jasher only added to the confusion. The English translation of Jasher, published in 1840, brought the book to a much wider audience. The translator, Moses Samuel, claimed to have worked from an ancient Hebrew manuscript that had been preserved in the Jewish community of Safed in Palestine. But again, no one could verify these claims, and the supposed manuscript was never made available for scholarly examination. Samuel's translation became the standard English version of Jasher, and it was this translation that caught the attention of religious communities in America and Europe. Many readers were fascinated by the additional details it provided about familiar biblical stories. Some religious leaders endorsed it as authentic ancient scripture, while others warned against accepting it too readily. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints showed particular interest in Jasher, with some leaders suggesting it was one of the ancient books that would be restored in the last days. This endorsement helped spread Jasher's influence in certain religious circles, though the Church never officially canonized the text. The academic response to Jasher's reappearance was mixed. Some scholars were intrigued by its content and wanted to study it seriously. Others were skeptical from the beginning and pointing out the lack of manuscript evidence and the suspicious circumstances of its discovery. The debate over Jasher's authenticity became part of larger discussions about how to evaluate ancient texts. What's particularly interesting is how Jasher's reappearance coincided with the broader renaissance of interest in ancient texts. The 17th century saw the discovery or rediscovery of many works that had been lost for centuries. Some of these discoveries were genuine, others were forgeries, and still others fell into the gray area between authentic tradition and later composition. The printing press played a crucial role in Jasher's spread. Once the text was in print, it could be copied and distributed widely, regardless of questions about its authenticity. Readers could judge for themselves whether the book seemed genuine or not. Many found its stories compelling enough that questions of historical accuracy seemed secondary. The mystery deepened when scholars began analyzing the Hebrew text more carefully. The language showed signs of being relatively recent, possibly medieval rather than ancient, but it also contained elements that seemed to preserve genuine ancient traditions. This mixed evidence made it difficult to reach definitive conclusions about the book's origins. Some researchers suggested that Jasher might be a medieval work based on genuinely ancient sources. This would explain both the linguistic evidence pointing to a later date and the content that seemed to reflect ancient traditions. It would also explain why the book felt both familiar and strange to readers acquainted with biblical narratives. The question of how Jasher survived the centuries between its ancient mentions and its modern reappearance remains unanswered. If the book really is ancient, it must have been preserved in some community or library that maintained it through the medieval period. If it's a later composition, then its author drew on traditions that had been preserved in other forms. Today, the Book of Jasher continues to find readers despite ongoing scholarly debates about its authenticity. For some, it provides valuable insight into how ancient stories were understood and interpreted. For others, it's simply an interesting work of historical fiction. But for everyone, it represents one of the most intriguing mysteries in the history of ancient literature, the Book of Jasher and the Bible. The relationship between the Book of Jasher and the canonical Bible is both fascinating and complex. Jasher reads like an expanded director's cut of the first books of the Bible, providing additional scenes, dialogue, and character development that flesh out the familiar stories. Yet this expansion creates as many questions as it answers, particularly about how closely Jasher aligns with accepted biblical tradition. In most cases, Jasher doesn't contradict the Bible so much as supplement it. When the Bible mentions an event briefly, Jasher often provides extensive detail. When the Bible introduces a character with minimal background, Jasher frequently offers rich biographical information. This complementary relationship suggests that whoever wrote Jasher was deeply familiar with biblical narratives and sought to enhance rather than replace them. The creation account in Jasher follows the same basic structure as Genesis, but adds philosophical reflection and additional detail. Where Genesis describes God's creative acts in broad strokes, Jasher sometimes provides more specific information about the process. The two accounts read like different versions of the same story, told by different authors with different emphases. Jasher's treatment of the patriarchs reveals particularly interesting variations from the biblical accounts. The book provides extensive background on Abraham's early life, including detailed stories about his childhood and his initial rejection of idol worship. These stories don't appear in Genesis, but they align with Jewish traditions that were passed down through oral teaching and later rabbinic literature. The flood narrative in Jasher is dramatically expanded from the biblical version. Where Genesis provides a relatively straightforward account of the flood's beginning, duration, and end, Jasher offers vivid descriptions of the flood's effects on different regions and populations. The book describes the panic and desperation of those left outside the ark, the gradual rising of the waters, and the ultimate devastation of the ancient world. What's particularly striking is how Jasher handles the relationship between divine action and human choice. The Bible often presents God's interventions as direct and immediate, while Jasher frequently shows God working through natural processes and human decisions. This doesn't diminish God's sovereignty, but shows it operating through more subtle and complex means. The book's treatment of moral issues generally aligns with biblical teaching, though Jasher sometimes provides more explicit commentary on the ethical dimensions of various actions. Characters in Jasher often engage in moral reasoning, explaining their choices and wrestling with ethical dilemmas in ways that the more laconic biblical texts rarely show. Jasher's chronology follows the biblical timeline closely, but sometimes provides more specific dates and time periods. The book shows careful attention to maintaining consistency with biblical chronology while filling in gaps and providing additional precision. This attention to chronological detail suggests the author was concerned with historical accuracy, at least as he understood it. The theological perspective of Jasher reflects mainstream Jewish thought, emphasizing God's justice, mercy, and faithfulness to his covenant. The book portrays God as intimately involved in human affairs while respecting human freedom and responsibility. This theological balance matches the sophisticated understanding found in the best of Jewish religious literature. One area where Jasher diverges from typical biblical style is in its psychological portraiture. The book provides detailed descriptions of characters' inner lives, their motivations, fears, and hopes. Biblical narratives often leave readers to infer psychological states from actions and brief dialogue, while Jasher makes these internal dimensions explicit. The book's treatment of women is also notable. Jasher provides more detailed portraits of female characters than the Bible typically offers, sometimes expanding their roles and giving them more agency in the narrative. This doesn't contradict biblical teaching, but shows a different emphasis in storytelling and one that pays more attention to women's experiences and perspectives. Jasher's approach to miracles and supernatural events is consistent with the biblical worldview, but often provides more naturalistic explanations for extraordinary events. The book shows God working through natural processes and human agency rather than relying solely on dramatic miraculous interventions. This approach makes the stories feel more grounded while maintaining their spiritual significance. The relationship between Jasher and later Jewish tradition is also worth noting. Many of the stories and interpretations found in Jasher appear in rabbinic literature, suggesting either that Jasher drew on well-established traditions or that it helped shape later Jewish understanding of biblical narratives. Either way, the book represents an important link in the chain of Jewish biblical interpretation. For modern readers, Jasher's relationship to the Bible raises important questions about how we understand religious authority and canonical boundaries. If Jasher really is ancient, does it deserve the same respect as canonical scripture? If it's later, can it still provide valuable insight into biblical interpretation? These questions don't have simple answers, but they highlight the complex process by which religious traditions develop and change over time. The book's influence on later biblical interpretation has been significant, even among those who question its authenticity. Many of the stories and interpretations found in Jasher have become part of popular understanding of biblical narratives, shaping how people visualize and understand familiar stories. In this sense, Jasher has become part of the broader tradition of biblical interpretation, regardless of its historical origins. Creation in Jasher. The book of Jasher opens with a creation account that both echoes and expands the familiar story from Genesis. Where the biblical account moves with majestic brevity through the 6 days of creation, Jasher provides additional detail and philosophical reflection, creating a more elaborate picture of how the world came to be. In Jasher's telling, God's creative work is presented as a deliberate, thoughtful process rather than a series of sudden commands. The book describes God planning and preparing for each stage of creation, considering how each element will relate to the others. This portrayal emphasizes divine wisdom and intentionality in a way that complements the biblical account without contradicting it. The creation of light receives particular attention in Jasher. The book describes this primordial light as different from the light of the sun, moon, and stars that would come later. This light was pure and spiritual, illuminating not just the physical world, but providing the foundation for all knowledge and understanding. The book suggests this original light continues to exist, hidden within the world and revealed to those who seek divine wisdom. When Jasher describes the separation of waters, it provides vivid imagery of cosmic organization. The book portrays the waters above and below as vast reservoirs, carefully balanced to maintain the world's stability. This cosmic engineering is presented as evidence of God's infinite wisdom and power, creating a universe that operates according to reliable principles. The formation of dry land is described in Jasher as a gradual process, with mountains rising and valleys forming according to divine design. The book provides names for some of these primordial features, suggesting that the ancient world retained memories of the earliest geographical formations. This attention to geographical detail reflects the book's concern with historical specificity. Jasher's account of plant creation emphasizes the incredible diversity and beauty of the vegetable kingdom. The book describes God creating not just functional plants for food and shelter, but also flowers and trees purely for beauty and pleasure. This aesthetic dimension of creation highlights the divine appreciation for beauty and the intention that the world should be a place of joy as well as sustenance. The creation of celestial bodies receives extended treatment in Jasher. The book describes the sun, moon, and stars as more than just sources of light. They are portrayed as cosmic timepieces, designed to mark seasons, years, and important events. Jasher suggests that the movements of heavenly bodies were coordinated with earthly events, creating a universe where cosmic and human history were intimately connected. The creation of sea creatures is described with wonder and amazement in Jasher. The book portrays the oceans as teeming with an incredible variety of life, from tiny creatures to massive sea monsters. This marine creation is presented as evidence of God's creativity and power, showing divine ability to create life in environments that humans could never inhabit. Jasher's description of bird creation emphasizes freedom and beauty. The book describes countless species of birds, each with unique characteristics and abilities. The gift of flight is portrayed as a special blessing, allowing birds to move between earth and sky in ways that connect the different realms of creation. This freedom of movement is presented as a foretaste of the liberty that all creation will ultimately enjoy. The creation of land animals receives detailed attention in Jasher, with the book describing the formation of different species and their various characteristics. The book emphasizes the harmony that originally existed between different animal species, suggesting that predation and conflict were not part of the original design. This peaceful coexistence is presented as part of the perfection that characterized the world before human disobedience. When Jasher turns to human creation, it provides extensive detail about God's careful formation of Adam. The book describes the divine consultation that preceded human creation, with God considering how to make beings capable of relationship with the divine. The formation of Adam from dust is portrayed as a delicate process, with God carefully shaping every feature and organ. The breath of life that God breathed into Adam is described in Jasher as more than just biological animation. The book suggests this divine breath gave humans unique capabilities, the ability to think, choose, create, and relate to God. This spiritual dimension of human nature is what distinguished humans from other creatures and made them capable of genuine relationship with their Creator. Jasher's account of Eve's creation emphasizes the divine intention for human companionship and partnership. The book describes Adam's loneliness and God's recognition that solitude was not good for human beings. Eve's formation from Adam's rib is portrayed as creating a being who was both similar enough for true companionship and different enough to provide complementary perspectives and abilities. The Garden of Eden is described in Jasher as a place of incredible beauty and abundance. The book provides details about the various trees, flowers, and fruits that grew there, emphasizing both their beauty and their nutritional value. The garden is portrayed as a place where humans could find everything they needed for both physical and spiritual flourishing. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil receive special attention in Jasher. The book describes these trees as unique in all creation, possessing qualities that set them apart from all other vegetation. The tree of life is portrayed as the source of eternal youth and vitality, while the tree of knowledge is described as containing the secrets of moral understanding that God had reserved for divine wisdom alone. Throughout its creation account, Jasher emphasizes the goodness and perfection of God's work. Each element of creation is described as perfectly suited for its purpose, beautifully designed, and harmoniously integrated with everything else. This perfection serves as a backdrop for the tragic disruption that would follow human disobedience, making the fall from grace all the more poignant. The story of Adam and Eve. The book of Jasher provides a rich and detailed account of humanity's first parents, expanding far beyond the biblical narrative to create vivid portraits of Adam and Eve as complex individuals facing unprecedented challenges. The book presents them not as distant mythological figures, but as real people grappling with the fundamental questions of existence, morality, and relationship with the divine. In Jasher's telling, Adam awakens to consciousness with immediate awareness of his unique position in creation. The book describes his first moments of life as filled with wonder and recognition of God's goodness. Adam's initial exploration of the garden is portrayed as a joyful discovery of the world's beauty and abundance, with every sight and sound bringing fresh amazement. The naming of the animals is described in Jasher as more than just a linguistic exercise. The book portrays Adam as understanding the essential nature of each creature and giving names that reflected their true characteristics. This ability to see into the heart of things is presented as evidence of Adam's original wisdom and his close relationship with the divine source of all knowledge. Adam's loneliness is portrayed in Jasher with psychological depth and emotional resonance. The book describes his growing awareness that while he could appreciate the beauty of creation and enjoy God's presence, he lacked the companionship that would complete his own nature. This loneliness is not presented as a flaw, but as part of God's design to prepare Adam for the gift of human relationship. The creation of Eve is described in Jasher with particular attention to the divine intention behind human partnership. The book presents God's decision to create a companion for Adam as motivated by love and wisdom, recognizing that human beings needed both divine and human relationship to flourish. Eve's formation from Adam's rib is portrayed as creating a being who shared his essential nature while bringing her own unique perspective and abilities. Adam's first sight of Eve is described in Jasher with poetic beauty and emotional intensity. The book captures his joy and wonder at finally meeting someone who could understand and share his experiences. Their first conversation is portrayed as a meeting of minds and hearts, establishing the foundation for human love and partnership. The book provides extensive detail about Adam and Eve's life in Eden before their disobedience. They are portrayed as living in perfect harmony with each other, with nature, and with God. Their days are filled with exploration, learning, and worship, creating a picture of human life as it was intended to be, free from conflict, fear, and want. Jasher describes the regular visits that God made to the garden, walking and talking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. These conversations are portrayed as the highlight of their existence, times when they could learn directly from their Creator and grow in understanding of themselves and their world. The book emphasizes the intimacy and joy of these divine encounters. The trees of the garden receive detailed attention in Jasher, particularly the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The book describes these trees as beautiful beyond description, with fruit that was especially appealing to the senses. The prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge is portrayed as a loving boundary designed to protect Adam and Eve from consequences they couldn't fully understand. The entrance of the serpent into the garden is described in Jasher with dramatic tension and psychological insight. The book portrays the serpent as cunning and persuasive, approaching Eve when she was alone and vulnerable. The temptation scene is expanded with detailed dialogue, showing how the serpent gradually undermined Eve's confidence in God's word and goodness. Eve's internal struggle is portrayed in Jasher with remarkable psychological realism. The book describes her growing doubt about God's intentions, her increasing desire for the forbidden fruit, and her eventual decision to disobey. This is not presented as a momentary lapse, but as a process of moral deterioration that ultimately led to the tragic choice. The act of disobedience itself is described in Jasher with solemnity and sadness. The book portrays Eve's eating of the fruit as a moment of cosmic significance, when innocence was lost and the world was fundamentally changed. Adam's decision to join her in disobedience is presented as a choice made from love but resulting in shared guilt and consequence. The immediate aftermath of their disobedience is described in Jasher with vivid detail. The book portrays their sudden awareness of nakedness, not just as physical embarrassment, but as a symbol of their new vulnerability and shame. Their attempts to hide from God are presented as futile but understandable responses to their changed relationship with the divine. God's response to their disobedience is portrayed in Jasher as a mixture of justice and mercy. The book describes God's disappointment and anger at their choice, but also his continued love and concern for their welfare. The questioning of Adam and Eve is presented not as information gathering, but as an opportunity for confession and repentance. The curse that followed their disobedience is described in Jasher as a natural consequence of their choice rather than arbitrary punishment. The book portrays the introduction of death, suffering, and conflict as the inevitable result of moral rebellion against the source of life and goodness. Yet even in pronouncing judgment, God's love and mercy are evident. The promise of redemption embedded in God's response to the serpent is given special attention in Jasher. The book presents this promise as the first glimmer of hope in humanity's darkest hour, suggesting that God's plan for restoration was already in motion even as the consequences of disobedience were being announced. The expulsion from Eden is described in Jasher as both punishment and protection. The book portrays God's decision to prevent Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of life as an act of mercy, ensuring that they would not be trapped forever in a state of sinful immortality. Their departure from the garden is presented as the beginning of a new chapter in human history, one marked by struggle but also by the possibility of redemption. Cain and Abel revisited. The story of Cain and Abel in the book of Jasher transforms the familiar biblical account into a richly detailed narrative that explores the psychological depths of sibling rivalry, the nature of worship, and the tragic consequences of unchecked jealousy. Where the biblical account provides only the essential facts, Jasher fills in the emotional and relational background that makes this ancient tragedy feel immediate and personal. Jasher begins by describing the childhood of Cain and Abel, portraying them as brothers who started life with equal advantages, but gradually developed different personalities and interests. Cain is presented as the older, more serious brother who took naturally to farming and agriculture. Abel is portrayed as gentler and more spiritually inclined, drawn to the care of flocks and the contemplation of God's creation. The book provides extensive background on the brothers' different approaches to life and work. Cain is described as ambitious and driven, always seeking to improve his agricultural techniques and increase his harvests. He took pride in his ability to make the earth produce abundant crops, seeing his success as evidence of his own skill and effort. Abel, by contrast, is portrayed as more contemplative and spiritually minded. Jasher describes him as spending long hours with his flocks, using the solitude to think about God and the meaning of life. His approach to shepherding was characterized by gentleness and care, treating each animal as a precious gift from the Creator. The differences between the brothers became more pronounced as they reached adulthood. Jasher describes growing tension between them over questions of inheritance, responsibility, and their parents' affections. Cain, as the eldest, expected to receive the primary inheritance and leadership of the family, but he sensed that Abel enjoyed their parents' special favor. The book provides detailed descriptions of the brothers' respective occupations. Cain's farming is portrayed as backbreaking work that required constant vigilance against weeds, pests, and weather. Success in agriculture demanded not just hard work, but also intelligence, planning, and adaptability. Cain took pride in mastering these challenges and creating abundance from the earth. Abel's shepherding is described as equally demanding, but in different ways. Jasher portrays shepherding as requiring patience, courage, and deep understanding of animal behavior. Abel had to protect his flocks from predators, find adequate pasture and water, and care for sick or injured animals. His success came from developing intimate knowledge of each animal's needs and character. The book describes the brothers' different relationships with their parents. Adam and Eve are portrayed as loving both sons, but connecting with them in different ways. Cain shared Adam's experience of working the ground and understood the satisfaction of agricultural success. Abel's gentler nature and spiritual sensitivity resonated more with Eve's emotional and intuitive approach to life. As the brothers matured, their different perspectives on life became sources of philosophical disagreement. Jasher describes conversations between them about the nature of work, success, and their relationship with God. Cain believed that human effort and achievement were the primary measures of worth, while Abel emphasized humility, dependence on God, and spiritual values over material success. The book provides extensive detail about the religious practices of the early world. Jasher describes how Adam and Eve had taught their sons to offer sacrifices as expressions of gratitude and worship. These offerings were not just religious obligations, but opportunities to acknowledge God's goodness and seek divine blessing on their work and families. Cain's approach to sacrifice is described in Jasher as reflecting his general attitude toward life. He offered sacrifices dutifully, but without deep spiritual engagement. His offerings consisted of agricultural products, fruits, grains, and vegetables from his fields. He selected these offerings based on their abundance rather than their quality, seeing sacrifice as a necessary religious duty rather than a joyful expression of worship. Abel's sacrificial practices are portrayed very differently in Jasher. The book describes him as approaching sacrifice with reverence and careful preparation. He selected the finest animals from his flock, those without blemish or defect. His sacrifices were offered with prayer, thanksgiving, and genuine spiritual hunger for God's presence and blessing. The book provides a detailed account of the fateful day when both brothers brought their offerings to God. Jasher describes their preparations, their different attitudes as they approached the place of sacrifice, and the dramatic moment when God's response became clear. The scene is filled with tension and anticipation as both brothers await divine approval. God's acceptance of Abel's sacrifice and rejection of Cain's offering is described in Jasher as manifested through fire from heaven that consumed Abel's sacrifice while leaving Cain's offering untouched. This divine response was visible and unmistakable, creating a moment of triumph for Abel and devastating disappointment for Cain. The book provides extensive description of Cain's emotional response to this rejection. Jasher portrays him as experiencing a complex mixture of anger, shame, and jealousy. His anger was directed not just at God, but at Abel, whom he blamed for making him look bad by comparison. The rejection of his sacrifice felt like a rejection of his entire approach to life and work. Cain's internal struggle is described in Jasher with psychological insight and emotional realism. The book portrays him wrestling with feelings of inadequacy, resentment, and growing hatred toward his brother. What started as disappointment gradually transformed into something much darker and more dangerous. God's warning to Cain is described in Jasher as a compassionate attempt to help him overcome his dangerous emotions. The divine counsel is portrayed as both loving and urgent, warning Cain that sin was crouching at his door like a predator ready to destroy him. This warning represented a final opportunity for Cain to choose a different path. The book describes Cain's rejection of God's counsel and his decision to nurse his grievances rather than address them constructively. Jasher portrays this as the crucial moment when Cain chose the path that would lead to tragedy. His refusal to accept responsibility for his own spiritual condition sealed his fate and that of his brother. The murder itself is described in Jasher with dramatic intensity and moral horror. The book portrays Cain luring Abel to a remote location under false pretenses, then attacking him in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The act is presented not as a premeditated crime, but as the inevitable result of unchecked anger and jealousy. The aftermath of the murder is described with particular attention to Cain's psychological state. Jasher portrays him as immediately regretting his action, but being unable to undo what he had done. His attempted deception when God asked about Abel's whereabouts is presented as the desperate act of someone trying to escape consequences for an irreversible choice. God's response to Cain's crime is portrayed in Jasher as a perfect balance of justice and mercy. The curse that made Cain a wanderer was presented as natural consequence of his action, but the mark of protection that God placed on him demonstrated divine mercy, even toward those who had committed terrible crimes. The rise of wickedness. The book of Jasher paints a disturbing picture of how rapidly human civilization descended into corruption after the expulsion from Eden. What began with a single act of disobedience by Adam and Eve quickly multiplied into widespread violence, immorality, and rebellion against God. The book traces this moral deterioration with careful attention to how evil spreads through communities and across generations. In Jasher's account, the descendants of Cain became the primary agents of moral corruption in the ancient world. After his exile, Cain established the first city and named it after his son Enoch. This city became a center of technological innovation, but also moral rebellion. The book describes how Cain's descendants developed new tools, weapons, and techniques while simultaneously abandoning the worship of God. The most notorious of Cain's descendants was Lamech, who is portrayed in Jasher as a violent and proud man who took multiple wives and boasted about his killings. The book describes how Lamech's polygamy corrupted the institution of marriage that God had established for Adam and Eve. His violence and arrogance became models that influenced others throughout the ancient world. Jasher provides detailed descriptions of the technological advances made by Cain's lineage. Tubal-Cain is portrayed as a master metalworker who created not just tools for agriculture and construction, but also weapons of war. Jubal is described as the inventor of musical instruments, though the book suggests that music was often used for immoral entertainment rather than worship of God. The book describes how these technological advances became sources of pride and self-sufficiency rather than opportunities for gratitude to God. The descendants of Cain began to see themselves as the masters of their own destiny, capable of creating whatever they needed without divine assistance. This technological hubris became a foundation for spiritual rebellion. Meanwhile, the descendants of Seth initially maintained their devotion to God and continued the practice of calling upon the divine name. Jasher describes how Seth's lineage preserved the knowledge of God and the proper forms of worship that had been established by Adam and Eve. For several generations, they remained separate from the corrupting influence of Cain's descendants. The book provides extensive detail about the gradual breakdown of this separation. As populations grew and spread across the earth, contact between the two lineages became inevitable. Jasher describes how the descendants of Seth were initially horrified by the violence and immorality they encountered among Cain's people, but gradually became desensitized to these behaviors. The critical turning point, according to Jasher, came when the sons of God began to intermarry with the daughters of men. The book describes this as a catastrophic mixing of the righteous and unrighteous lineages that led to the rapid spread of corruption throughout human society. These marriages were motivated by physical attraction rather than spiritual compatibility, leading to families where godliness was gradually abandoned. Jasher describes the children of these mixed marriages as particularly prone to violence and rebellion. The book portrays them as physically powerful but morally corrupt, using their strength to oppress others and indulge their own desires. These individuals became leaders and rulers in the ancient world, spreading their influence and corrupting entire communities. The book provides vivid descriptions of the violence that characterized this period. Murder became commonplace, often motivated by greed, jealousy, or simple desire for dominance. The strong oppressed the weak without restraint, and justice became a matter of personal power rather than moral principle. The earth was filled with violence and corruption. Sexual immorality is also described in Jasher as reaching extreme levels during this period. The book portrays the abandonment of marriage boundaries. the exploitation of women and children, and the development of practices that violated the natural order God had established. These behaviors were not hidden but celebrated as expressions of personal freedom and power. The book describes how religious worship became corrupted during this time. Instead of acknowledging the true God who had created them, people began to worship idols made from wood, stone, and metal. These idols were often associated with immoral practices and violent rituals that further degraded human dignity and social order. Jasher portrays the corruption as affecting every aspect of human society. Commerce became characterized by fraud and exploitation. Governance became tyrannical and self-serving. Education abandoned moral instruction in favor of teaching techniques for gaining power and wealth. Even family relationships were corrupted by selfishness and violence. The book describes how the few righteous individuals remaining in the world became increasingly isolated and persecuted. Those who maintained their faith in God and tried to live moral lives found themselves surrounded by hostility and mockery. The social pressure to conform to prevailing corruption was enormous, and many gave up their principles rather than face persecution. Despite this overwhelming wickedness, Jasher emphasizes that God did not abandon the human race entirely. The book describes divine warnings sent through righteous individuals who called for repentance and return to proper worship. These warnings were generally ignored or rejected, but they demonstrated God's continued love for humanity and desire for restoration. The book also describes how God's patience and mercy were evident in the gradual nature of divine judgment. Rather than immediately destroying the corrupt world, God provided multiple opportunities for repentance and reform. The long lifespan of early humans is presented as evidence of divine mercy, giving people extended time to recognize their errors and change their ways. Jasher portrays Enoch as a particularly important figure during this period of corruption. The book describes how Enoch walked with God and received divine revelation about the coming judgment. His translation to heaven without experiencing death is presented as both a reward for his faithfulness and a sign to the wicked world that God remained present and active despite appearances to the contrary. The book describes how the corruption eventually reached a point where divine judgment became inevitable. Jasher portrays God as grieving over the moral failure of humanity while recognizing that continued patience would only allow the corruption to spread further. The decision to send the flood is presented as a last resort, motivated by justice, but implemented with sorrow. Throughout its description of this period, Jasher emphasizes that the wickedness was not inevitable, but resulted from human choices. The book portrays each generation as having the opportunity to choose righteousness or corruption, and describes how the accumulated weight of wrong choices eventually created a culture where evil became normal and good was seen as foolish or weak. Enoch's secret wisdom. The book of Jasher presents Enoch as one of the most remarkable figures in human history, a man who achieved such intimacy with God that he was eventually taken to heaven without experiencing death. The book provides extensive detail about Enoch's life, his spiritual development, and the extraordinary wisdom he received through divine revelation. According to Jasher, Enoch was born into a world that was rapidly descending into moral corruption. His grandfather was Jared, and his father was Jared's son, who had maintained the family's commitment to righteous living despite the growing wickedness around them. From an early age, Enoch showed unusual spiritual sensitivity and a deep hunger for understanding God's ways. The book describes Enoch's childhood as marked by careful observation of the natural world and serious contemplation of life's deeper meanings. While other children played games and pursued frivolous activities, Enoch spent time studying the movements of celestial bodies, the patterns of seasons, and the behavior of animals. This early interest in understanding divine order prepared him for the revelations he would later receive. As a young man, Enoch is portrayed in Jasher as grieving deeply over the moral condition of his contemporaries. The book describes how he watched violence and corruption spread throughout human society and felt compelled to seek God's perspective on these troubling developments. His spiritual hunger led him to spend extended periods in prayer and meditation, seeking divine guidance. The book provides detailed descriptions of Enoch's first encounters with divine revelation. Jasher portrays these initial experiences as overwhelming and transformative, opening Enoch's understanding to spiritual realities that were hidden from ordinary human perception. These revelations began gradually but intensified over time as Enoch proved faithful with the knowledge he received. One of the most significant aspects of Enoch's wisdom, according to Jasher, was his understanding of future events. The book describes how God revealed to Enoch the coming judgment that would destroy the corrupt world through a great flood. This prophetic knowledge was both a burden and a responsibility, as Enoch was called to warn his contemporaries about the consequences of their wickedness. Jasher describes Enoch as becoming a powerful preacher and teacher who traveled throughout the ancient world proclaiming God's message of judgment and mercy. His preaching was accompanied by signs and wonders that demonstrated divine authority. But the book emphasizes that his greatest power lay in the wisdom and spiritual insight he had received through divine revelation. The book provides extensive detail about the content of Enoch's teaching. He is portrayed as explaining the nature of God's holiness and justice, the seriousness of human sin, and the necessity of repentance and moral reform. His messages were clear and uncompromising, but they were also filled with compassion for those who were trapped in cycles of corruption and violence. According to Jasher, Enoch also received extensive revelation about the structure of the heavens and the nature of angelic beings. The book describes how he was given knowledge about different levels of spiritual reality, the roles of various angelic orders, and the cosmic conflict between good and evil. This celestial knowledge set Enoch apart from all other human teachers of his time. The book describes how Enoch's teaching ministry was both successful and controversial. Many people were drawn to his wisdom and experienced spiritual transformation through his influence. Others rejected his message and persecuted him for challenging their corrupt lifestyle. Jasher portrays Enoch as continuing his ministry despite opposition, motivated by love for God and concern for human souls. One of the most remarkable aspects of Enoch's story in Jasher is his relationship with God, which is described as progressively deepening over many years. The book portrays this relationship as characterized by regular communication, mutual trust, and growing intimacy. Enoch is presented as someone who learned to see the world from God's perspective and to align his heart completely with divine purposes. Jasher describes how Enoch's spiritual development led to physical transformation as well. The book suggests that his extended communion with God began to change his very nature, making him less bound by ordinary human limitations. This transformation was gradual but steady, preparing him for his eventual transition to heavenly existence. The book provides detailed descriptions of Enoch's final years on earth, when his communion with God became so intense that he spent most of his time in spiritual rather than physical activities. Jasher portrays him as living increasingly in the heavenly realm while still maintaining his earthly body and relationships. This dual existence was unprecedented in human experience. According to Jasher, Enoch's translation to heaven was not sudden, but occurred gradually over a period of time. The book describes how he began making shorter and shorter appearances among his family and followers, spending increasing amounts of time in direct communion with God. His eventual departure was more like a natural completion of a process than an abrupt removal. The book emphasizes that Enoch's translation was not just a reward for his personal faithfulness, but also served important purposes for humanity. His removal from the earth before the flood demonstrated God's ability to preserve the righteous from judgment. His continued existence in heaven provided hope that death was not the final destiny for those who walked faithfully with God. Jasher describes the impact of Enoch's life and teaching on his contemporaries and subsequent generations. While many rejected his message during his lifetime, his example of intimate relationship with God inspired others to seek similar spiritual depth. The memory of his righteousness and wisdom became a standard by which later generations measured spiritual achievement. The book also suggests that Enoch's wisdom was preserved in written form for future generations. Jasher describes how Enoch recorded the revelations he received, creating a body of literature that would continue to instruct and inspire long after his departure from earth. These writings are presented as containing profound insights into the nature of God, the meaning of human existence, and the ultimate destiny of creation. Throughout its portrayal of Enoch, Jasher emphasizes that his extraordinary achievements were not due to inherent superiority, but to his consistent choice to seek God with his whole heart. The book presents Enoch as an example of what becomes possible when a human being commits completely to knowing and serving God, regardless of the corruption and opposition in the surrounding culture. Noah's early years. The book of Jasher provides a rich and detailed account of Noah's childhood and early development, portraying him as a remarkable individual whose character and calling were evident from his earliest years. Unlike the biblical account, which introduces Noah as an adult, Jasher traces his story from birth, showing how his destiny as humanity's deliverer was shaped by both divine selection and personal choices. According to Jasher, Noah's birth was surrounded by extraordinary circumstances that marked him as someone special in God's plan. The book describes portents and signs that accompanied his arrival, suggesting to his family that this child would play a crucial role in the unfolding of divine purposes. His grandfather Methuselah, who had received prophetic insight from his father Enoch, recognized Noah's significance immediately. The book portrays Noah's childhood as taking place during the darkest period of human history, when violence and corruption had reached unprecedented levels. Yet Jasher describes how Noah's family maintained their commitment to righteousness despite the overwhelming wickedness around them. This family environment provided Noah with moral grounding and spiritual instruction that would prove crucial for his later calling. Jasher describes young Noah as unusually thoughtful and observant, showing early signs of the wisdom and discernment that would characterize his adult life. While other children were drawn to the games and entertainments popular in their corrupt culture, Noah preferred solitary activities that allowed him to think deeply about life's meaning and purpose. The book provides extensive detail about Noah's education and spiritual development. His grandfather, Methuselah, is portrayed as his primary teacher, passing down the knowledge and traditions that had been preserved from Adam through the righteous lineage. This education included not just practical skills, but also deep spiritual truths about God's nature and purposes. According to Jasher, Noah showed early signs of prophetic sensitivity, receiving dreams and visions that provided glimpses of future events. The book describes how these spiritual experiences both troubled and inspired the young Noah, giving him insight into God's plans while burdening him with knowledge of coming judgment. The book describes Noah's growing awareness of the moral corruption around him and his deep distress at the violence and immorality that characterized his contemporaries. Jasher portrays him as struggling to understand how humans created in God's image could descend to such depths of wickedness. This struggle led to periods of intense prayer and seeking for divine understanding. As Noah reached adolescence, Jasher describes him as becoming increasingly convinced that divine judgment was inevitable. His prophetic insights, combined with the teaching he had received from Methuselah, led him to understand that God would not allow the corruption to continue indefinitely. This knowledge set him apart from his peers and made him seem strange to many of his contemporaries. The book provides detailed descriptions of Noah's character development during these formative years. He is portrayed as growing in wisdom, compassion, and moral courage, but also as bearing the heavy burden of prophetic knowledge. Jasher describes how he learned to balance his grief over human wickedness with trust in God's ultimate justice and mercy. According to Jasher, Noah's calling as the builder of the ark was not revealed all at once, but came through a series of divine communications over many years. The book describes how God gradually prepared Noah for his mission, first revealing the certainty of coming judgment, then the means of preservation, and finally the specific instructions for the ark's construction. The book describes Noah's initial reaction to his calling as a mixture of awe, fear, and determination. Jasher portrays him as fully understanding the magnitude of the task before him, not just the physical challenge of building the ark, but the emotional burden of watching the world's destruction while preserving a remnant for the future. Jasher provides extensive detail about Noah's preparation for his mission. The book describes how he spent years studying the skills he would need for art construction, learning about animal behavior and care, and developing the physical and emotional strength required for the enormous task ahead. This preparation period is portrayed as essential for his eventual success. The book also describes Noah's marriage and the establishment of his family during this period. Jasher portrays his wife as a woman of exceptional character who shared his commitment to righteousness and his understanding of their divine calling. Their marriage is presented as a partnership based on shared spiritual values and mutual support in facing unprecedented challenges. According to Jasher, Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were born during the years when their father was receiving increasing clarity about his mission. The book describes how Noah raised his sons with full knowledge of what lay ahead, preparing them not just for survival, but for their roles as the fathers of the post-flood world. The book provides detailed descriptions of the family's preparations for the flood, which began years before the actual construction of the ark. Jasher describes how they gathered knowledge, collected seeds and tools, and developed the skills they would need to restart civilization after the waters receded. These preparations required both practical wisdom and extraordinary faith. Throughout its portrayal of Noah's early years, Jasher emphasizes the development of his character and faith. The book describes how each challenge and revelation contributed to his spiritual maturity, preparing him for the enormous responsibility he would bear as the preserver of human and animal life through the coming catastrophe. The book also describes Noah's growing reputation as a righteous man in his community. While many of his contemporaries dismissed him as eccentric or overly religious, others recognized his integrity and wisdom. Jasher portrays him as becoming a focal point for the few righteous individuals remaining in the corrupt world. As Noah approached the time when he would begin ark construction, Jasher describes him as a man fully prepared for his mission. The book portrays him as having developed the technical skills, spiritual maturity, and emotional strength necessary for the unprecedented task ahead. His early years had shaped him into exactly the kind of person God needed for humanity's preservation and renewal. Building the ark, Noah's hands trembled as he touched the gopher wood. The divine command echoed in his mind, clear as morning rain. Build an ark. The dimensions whispered themselves into his heart, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. These numbers would become his prayer, his purpose, his burden for the next century and more. The first tree fell with a thunderous crash that shook the earth. Noah's sons gathered around their father, watching him measure and mark the ancient timber. Shem traced the bark with curious fingers. Ham kicked at the sawdust. Japheth simply stared, trying to understand why his father spoke of floods when no cloud darkened the sky. Years passed like seasons of doubt. The neighbors came first with curiosity, then with laughter, finally with scorn. Noah's hammer rang out each dawn, a lonely song in a world growing darker. The wood took shape slowly, beam by beam, plank by careful plank. His hands grew rough and scarred, his back bent under the weight of divine purpose. The animals began arriving in the 20th year of construction. First came the gentle ones, deer stepping delicately through the morning mist, rabbits hopping between the growing ribs of the great vessel. Noah's wife scattered grain for them, whispering soft words of welcome. The children of the neighborhood pointed and laughed, but their parents pulled them away, uneasy now. By the 40th year, the ark's skeleton stretched across the landscape like the bones of some impossible beast. Noah preached as he worked, his voice carrying across the fields where people tended their crops. "Turn from your ways," he called to them. "The waters are coming." They threw stones at his words, but still he hammered, still he built, still he warned. The lions arrived in year 60, padding through the construction site with golden eyes that seemed to know secrets. Eagles nested in the incomplete decking. Elephants wandered close, their ancient wisdom recognizing something their human neighbors could not see. Noah began building the feeding systems, the waste channels, the countless details that would keep this floating world alive. His sons married in the 70th year. Shem chose a woman of gentle spirit who helped tend the gathering animals. Ham's wife brought energy and laughter, though she sometimes questioned the great work. Japheth's bride possessed a quiet strength that reminded Noah of his own dear wife. The four women worked together, preparing food stores, weaving blankets, gathering seeds for the world to come. The mockery grew cruel as the years stretched on. Former friends crossed the street to avoid Noah's family. Children threw mud at the growing ark. Market vendors refused to sell them food. Yet Noah's hammer never stopped its steady rhythm. Each nail driven home was an act of faith. Each board placed was a prayer for mercy. In year 90, the ark began to look like what it was meant to be. The hull curved gracefully from bow to stern. 3 decks divided the interior into vast chambers. Windows let in gentle light. The door gaped wide, waiting for its cargo of life. Noah stood back sometimes, amazed at what his hands had built under heaven's guidance. The animals came faster now, as if sensing time's approach. Wolves arrived with their eternal enemies, the sheep, yet they lay down together in the shadow of the ark. Serpents coiled peacefully beside mice. Bears lumbered past rabbits without a second glance. The natural order held its breath, waiting. Noah's preaching grew more urgent in the final decades. His voice, weathered by years of calling out warnings, cracked with desperate love for his neighbors. "Please," he would say, stopping strangers in the market, "the flood is coming. There is room in the ark." They laughed harder now, pointing at his white beard, his sun-darkened skin, his hands permanently stained with pitch and wood sap. Year 100 arrived with a sense of completion. The ark stood finished, its sides gleaming with protective coating. Every room was ready, every system tested. The great door hung open like an invitation to salvation. Noah's family gathered on the deck at sunset, looking out over the world they would soon leave forever. The final 20 years brought a strange peace. The building was done, but the waiting had begun. Noah tended his floating menagerie, learning their needs, their habits, their individual personalities. He named many of them, these creatures who would help restart the world. His wife sang lullabies to frightened animals. Their daughters-in-law learned to speak the language of beasts. Still, the people came to stare and laugh. Some threw garbage at the ark's sides. Others composed mocking songs about old Noah and his floating zoo. But a few, just a few, approached quietly in the darkness. "Is there truly room?" they would whisper. Noah's heart broke each time he had to explain that the invitation was for 8 humans, no more, no less. The morning of departure came without fanfare. God's voice, gentle as a father's whisper, told Noah the time had arrived. The animals formed orderly lines, as if they had practiced this moment for decades. 2 by 2, 7 by 7, they entered the ark with dignity and purpose. Noah watched each one pass through the door, these passengers who trusted him with their species' future. His family climbed aboard last. Shem helped his wife with her bundle of precious seeds. Ham carried his tools, unable to believe he would never use them again on familiar ground. Japheth supported his father's steps, noting how the old man's legs shook with exhaustion and emotion. Noah's wife took one final look at the home they had built, the garden she had tended, the neighbors who had become strangers. The great door swung shut with a sound like thunder, not by human hands, but by the same power that had commanded the ark's creation. Inside, in the gentle darkness, Noah's family stood together among their animal companions. Outside, the world continued its dance toward judgment, unaware that mercy had just sealed itself away from the coming storm. The flood in Jasher. The first raindrops fell like tears from a broken heaven. Gentle at first, they kissed the dusty earth where Noah's neighbors had walked just hours before. Children caught them on their tongues, laughing at this strange gift from the cloudless sky that had stretched empty for so many years. Their parents looked up with mild curiosity, not yet understanding that these drops carried the weight of divine judgment. Inside the ark, Noah felt each drop as it struck the great vessel's roof. The sound echoed through the chambers where his family huddled among the animals. His wife reached for his weathered hand, her fingers tracing the scars left by decades of building. "It begins," she whispered, and Noah nodded, remembering the voice that had promised this moment would come. The rain grew stronger as the sun climbed higher. What had been drops became streams, streams became torrents. The earth, hard-packed from years without significant rain, resisted at first. Then the ancient springs began to break open, as if the planet itself was weeping from its deepest places. The great fountains of the deep burst forth with power that shook the ground like thunder. People stepped out of their homes now, confused by the water that ran in strange rivers down their familiar streets. Old men who had mocked Noah's warnings stood in their doorways, watching the sky with growing unease. Mothers called their children inside as the rain soaked through their clothes in moments. The laughter died away, replaced by the sound of rushing water and rising fear. Noah's family moved through the ark's chambers, tending to their frightened passengers. The animals sensed the change, their ancient instincts awakening to danger their human companions had ignored. Elephants trumpeted softly, lions paced in their quarters. Birds that had sung sweetly now huddled in silence, feathers pressed tight against the growing storm. By evening, the water reached the ankles of those who still walked outside. They splashed through puddles that had been solid ground that morning, their confidence shaken but not yet broken. "It's just a storm," they told each other. "It will pass." But the rain fell harder, driven by winds that came from no earthly source. The sky wept without ceasing, pouring out sorrow accumulated over centuries of human wickedness. The second day brought water to their knees. Families gathered on their rooftops, watching the floods swallow their gardens, their livestock, their carefully tended fields. Some remembered Noah's warnings now, his voice calling across the marketplace. "Turn from your ways, the waters are coming." They wished they had listened, but the great door had sealed itself shut, and mercy had a season that was now past. Inside the ark, Shem worked to calm the larger animals while his brothers managed the feeding systems their father had designed. The vessel rocked gently on the rising waters, its ancient wood creaking with new purpose. Noah stood at a window, watching the world of his birth disappear beneath the flood. His heart broke for every soul outside, even those who had thrown stones at his warnings. The third day lifted the ark from its resting place. The great vessel floated free, riding the swells of a new-made sea. Noah felt the moment of release, the gentle lifting that meant they were truly afloat now. His wife joined him at the window, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched familiar landmarks vanish under the endless rain. Their old home, the market where they had bought grain, the hill where they had courted as young people, all swallowed by the deep. The water rose with impossible speed now, claiming first the low places, then the valleys, finally the hills where desperate people had fled with their families. Those who had laughed at Noah's ark now swam frantically toward it, calling out promises of repentance, offers of service, desperate pleas for mercy. But the door that had stood open for 120 years remained sealed by the same hand that had commanded its building. Trees that had stood for centuries disappeared beneath the surface. Mountains that had seemed eternal were reduced to islands, then to barely visible peaks, then to memory. The rain continued its relentless work, washing away every trace of the world that had been. Cities vanished without a sound. Roads became riverbeds. Gardens turned to seafloor where fish would swim over the bones of those who had planted them. Ham struggled with his emotions as he watched the destruction. His wife wept openly for the friends they had left behind, the neighbors who had become enemies, but who were still human, still precious to the heart of their Creator. "Why could we not save them?" she asked, and Ham had no answer. The justice of it was beyond their understanding, wrapped in mysteries too deep for mortal minds. Japheth stood with his father as the rain entered its second week. The sky had become a gray ceiling of weeping, showing no sign of clearing. The wind howled across the endless sea, driving waves against the ark's sides with increasing fury. Yet the vessel rode steady, its divine design proof against every storm. "How long?" Japheth asked, and Noah shook his head. Only heaven knew the answer to that question. The animals adapted to their floating home with surprising grace. Predators and prey shared the same deck levels, their natural enmity suspended by the strange peace that had settled over the ark. The lions lay down with the lambs. The wolves shared food with the sheep. Even the smallest creatures, the insects and creeping things, maintained their orderly existence in this refuge from the storm. The 40th day arrived with no change in the weather. The rain fell as hard as ever, the wind blew as fierce, the waters rose as high, but something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere around the ark. Noah sensed it first, a subtle change in the quality of the storm. The judgment was complete. The earth had been washed clean. The time of rising was finished, and the season of waiting had begun. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started. One moment it drummed against the ark's roof with the fury of divine wrath. The next, silence settled over the floating world like a blanket. Noah's family gathered on the main deck, listening to the profound quiet. Even the animals seemed to hold their breath, half sensing that something fundamental had changed in the order of creation. Water stretched to every horizon, unbroken by any sign of land. The world had become an ocean, and they were its only passengers. The ark drifted on currents that flowed according to purposes they could not guess. Sometimes they saw pieces of the old world floating past. A broken roof beam, a clay pot, a child's toy that made Noah's wife turn away with fresh tears. The wind began to blow from a different direction, carrying scents that spoke of distant places, of a world being born again under heaven's patient care. The waters that had risen to destroy now cradled the ark like a mother's arms, carrying its precious cargo toward a future none of them could imagine. In the gentle rocking of their refuge, Noah's family began to understand that they were not just survivors, but seeds of tomorrow. After the flood, the dove returned with trembling wings and hope clutched in her tiny beak. Noah's weathered hands received her gently, his eyes focusing on the small green leaf she carried. Olive, fresh and bright with life. His heart leaped within him like a young man's, though his beard had grown white during the long months afloat. The waters were finally receding. The earth was remembering how to breathe again. His family gathered around him on the ark's deck, studying the precious leaf as if it held the secrets of creation itself. Shem touched it with one finger, marveling at its softness. Ham held it up to catch the morning light, watching the green veins that carried life through its delicate structure. Japheth simply smiled, the first real smile any of them had worn since the great door had sealed them away from the drowning world. The ark had found its resting place weeks earlier, settled against the slopes of Ararat with a gentle bump that woke them all from sleep. They had felt the great vessel shift and steady, no longer riding the endless swells, but grounded at last on something solid. Yet Noah had waited, patient as the seasons, for the sign that it was truly time to leave their floating sanctuary. Now that sign fluttered in the breeze, one small leaf carrying news of a world reborn. Noah's wife wept as she looked at it, tears of joy mixing with tears of sorrow for all that had been lost. The earth was healing, yes, but it was empty now, waiting for new voices to fill its silence. The weight of that responsibility settled on their shoulders like a mantle passed down from heaven itself. The great door opened with the same supernatural ease that had sealed it shut. Sunlight streamed into the ark's interior, bright and warm after the long twilight of their floating prison. The animals stirred restlessly, sensing freedom in the sweet air that carried scents of growing things. Birds called to each other with excitement, their songs echoing through the chambers where they had waited so patiently. Noah stepped onto solid ground first, his legs unsteady after months at sea. The earth felt strange beneath his feet, soft and giving where it had once been hard. New grass was already pushing through the mud, tender shoots of green that spoke of creation's eagerness to begin again. He knelt and pressed his palm against the ground, feeling the pulse of life that ran through it like a heartbeat. The animals emerged in orderly procession, as disciplined in their exodus as they had been in their boarding. The eagles spread their wings and soared toward distant peaks. The deer stepped delicately down the ramp, their eyes bright with wonder at the empty landscape. The lions padded into the sunlight with dignity, already scanning the horizon for territories to claim in this new world. Pairs became families as the animals dispersed across the cleansed earth. Noah watched them go with mixed emotions, these companions who had shared the long journey with him. He had grown to love many of them, these creatures who had trusted him with their lives and futures. Now they carried within them the seeds of every species, ready to fill the silence with new generations. The altar took shape slowly, built from stones still damp with floodwaters. Noah's sons helped him select each rock, weighing them in their hands as if choosing jewels for a crown. This would be their first act in the new world, this offering of gratitude to the power that had preserved them through the storm. The altar rose like a prayer made visible, reaching toward the heaven that had both judged and saved. Fire descended from above to consume the sacrifice, flames that burned without earthly fuel. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying their thanksgiving to the throne of mercy. Noah's family knelt around the altar, their faces reflecting the holy fire that sealed their covenant with tomorrow. They were no longer just survivors now, but the foundation stones of a world waiting to be built. The rainbow appeared as the fire died away, stretching across the sky like a bridge between earth and heaven. Its colors were brighter than any they had seen before, painted on the clouds with divine artistry. Noah stared at it in wonder, understanding without words that this was a promise, a sign that the waters would never again rise to swallow the world. The bow of war had been hung in the sky, pointing away from Earth toward the far reaches of space. His family stood together under that first rainbow, feeling the weight of their calling settle into their bones. 8 people to repopulate the earth, 8 voices to break the silence that stretched from mountain to sea, 8 hearts to carry forward the memories of those who had perished and the hopes of those yet to be born. The task seemed impossible, but they had learned to trust in impossibilities during their time afloat. The land spread before them, empty but not barren. Seeds slept in the mud, waiting for the right season to wake. Rivers carved new channels through the soft earth, carrying life to places that had never known water. The sun shone warmer here, or perhaps it only seemed so after the gray months of storm. Everything was beginning again, and they were its witnesses. Noah planted the first vineyard on the slopes below Ararat, pressing grape seeds into the willing earth with his own hands. His sons built homes from the timber they had salvaged, creating shelter for the families that would grow in this place. Their wives tended gardens that would feed the children they dreamed of having, the grandchildren who would carry their stories into the far future. The animals multiplied with remarkable speed, as if creation itself was eager to fill the empty spaces. Flocks of birds darkened the sky during their migrations to distant lands. Herds of wild horses thundered across the plains, their hooves drumming a rhythm that spoke of life returning to normal. Fish filled the rivers and seas, swimming in waters that had recently covered the highest mountains. Seasons turned as the new world found its rhythm. Spring brought flowers that seemed brighter than those Noah remembered from before the flood. Summer heat was tempered by breezes that carried the scent of growing things. Autumn painted the leaves with colors that made Noah's wife weep with their beauty. Winter brought snow that blanketed the earth like a promise of rest and renewal. Years passed and children's laughter began to echo across the empty landscape. Grandchildren climbed the trees that had grown from seeds their grandfathers planted. The human family grew and spread, following the rivers toward the sea, climbing the mountains toward the sky, always seeking new places to build and plant and sing the songs of life reborn. Noah lived to see his great-grandchildren playing in gardens that had never known the flood. He told them stories of the old world, of the ark that had saved them all, of the rainbow that sealed their future. Some believed every word. Others smiled and nodded, thinking these were just the tales that old men tell. But the rainbow still appeared after every storm, reminding those who had eyes to see that some promises are written in the sky itself. The earth was full again, but different now. Cleaner somehow, washed by the great rain that had taken away the stains of ancient wickedness. The animals were gentler, the plants more willing to grow, the seasons more predictable in their turning. It was as if creation itself had learned something from its time under the waters, had emerged from its baptism, ready to try again. Nimrod's kingdom. In the land of Shinar, where the rivers ran together like silver threads in a weaver's loom, a child was born who would shake the foundations of the new world. His name was Nimrod, and from his first breath, he seemed to draw power from the very air around him. His mother looked into his dark eyes and saw something that made her tremble, a hunger that would never be satisfied, an ambition that would reach toward heaven itself. The boy grew like a cedar tree in fertile soil, taller and stronger than his playmates. By his 10th year, he could wrestle grown men to the ground. By his 15th, he was leading hunting parties into the wilderness, bringing back game that had never been caught before. The other young men followed him with the devotion usually reserved for gods, drawn by the charisma that radiated from him like heat from a forge. Noah's great-grandson possessed gifts that went beyond mere physical strength. When he spoke, people listened as if his words carried the weight of prophecy. When he planned, even the wisest elders found themselves nodding in agreement. He could track a leopard through rocky ground, shoot an arrow through the eye of a hawk in flight, and navigate by stars that seemed to bend to his will. The first city he built rose from the plains like a miracle of stone and ambition. Where others had been content with simple villages, Nimrod dreamed of walls that touched the sky, of gates that could hold back armies, of towers that would make the earth itself seem small. His workers labored with the fever of men possessed, driven by their leader's vision of glory beyond anything the world had yet seen. Babel was its name, and it became the wonder of the ancient world. Travelers came from distant lands just to walk its streets, to marvel at its markets, to trade their goods in its vast squares. The city grew like a living thing, spreading across the plain, with an appetite for expansion that mirrored its founder's own restless hunger for power and dominion. Animals feared him as they had never feared any man since Adam. Lions fled from his approach. Bears retreated into their caves when they caught his scent. Eagles changed their flight paths to avoid the arrows that flew from his bow with supernatural accuracy. He wore their skins as trophies, their teeth as ornaments, their bones as symbols of his dominion over the natural world. The tribes of the earth began to gather around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet. They came seeking protection, trade, justice, opportunity. They stayed because something in Nimrod's presence made them feel part of something larger than themselves. His kingdom grew not just through conquest, but through the voluntary submission of people who sensed that this man was marked by destiny. His palace rose in the center of Babel, a structure that challenged the very concept of what buildings could be. Its walls were decorated with carvings that told the story of his victories, his hunts, his rise to power. Its halls echoed with the voices of ambassadors from nations that had never spoken to each other before Nimrod's influence brought them together under one roof. The laws he established were carved in stone and bronze, displayed in the city's squares where all could read them. Justice flowed from his throne like water from a spring, settling disputes that had festered for generations between rival clans. Trade flourished under his protection. The arts blossomed in the peace his strength provided. Children grew up never knowing the chaos that had marked the early years after the flood. But power, like wine, can intoxicate even the strongest soul. Nimrod began to see himself not just as a king, but as something approaching divinity. The people's adoration fed his pride until it grew beyond all healthy bounds. He started to speak of the old god as if they were equals, as if the power that had created heaven and earth was somehow subject to challenge from below. His advisors whispered poison in his ears, telling him that he was mightier than Noah had ever been, wiser than the patriarchs, stronger than the angels themselves. They pointed to his kingdom as proof that human will could accomplish anything, that divine intervention was unnecessary when human genius was properly applied. These words found fertile ground in a heart that had never learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. The old men, those who remembered the flood stories their grandfathers had told, began to feel uneasy in the great city. They saw something in their king's eyes that reminded them of the ancient wickedness that had brought down the waters. But their warnings were dismissed as the fears of aging minds, the superstitions of a less enlightened generation. Nimrod's marriage was a political masterstroke that consolidated his power across the known world. His bride was beautiful and intelligent, a woman whose family controlled important trade routes. Their wedding celebration lasted for 40 days and nights, with feasts that drew nobility from every corner of the earth. The gifts they received filled entire warehouses, tribute from kings who wanted to stay in his good favor. Children born in his kingdom grew up speaking of Nimrod the way previous generations had spoken of Noah. He was their hero, their protector, their model of what human potential could achieve. They played games that mimicked his hunting exploits. They built small towers in imitation of his great constructions. They dreamed of growing up to serve in his armies, to work on his projects, to bask in the glory that surrounded him like sunlight. The wealth of nations flowed into Babel like tributaries feeding a great river. Gold and silver, precious stones and rare woods, spices that made the air itself seem magical. The city's markets became the center of world commerce, the place where East met West, where North traded with South. Languages mingled in its streets like colors blending on an artist's palette. His generals conquered cities without fighting battles, their reputation alone enough to make enemies surrender. His engineers built roads that connected distant lands, bridges that spanned rivers others had thought impassable, aqueducts that brought fresh water to places that had known only thirst. His kingdom became the beating heart of civilization itself. But in the quiet moments when the crowds had gone home and the advisors had withdrawn, Nimrod would stand on his highest tower and look up at the stars. Something in their cold light reminded him that there were powers in the universe that cared nothing for his earthly glory. Something in their distant beauty whispered that true dominion belonged to another, that kings were still just men, that even the mightiest tower was still built on ground that could shake. Those moments of doubt never lasted long. The morning would bring new triumphs, new projects, new reasons to believe that he was master of his own destiny. The tower he was planning would reach higher than any building in history, so high that heaven itself would have to take notice. So high that the distinction between earth and sky would become meaningless. So high that Nimrod's name would be written among the stars themselves. The Tower of Babel. The blueprint stretched across tables like a map of impossible dreams. Nimrod's architects bent over the papyrus scrolls, their fingers tracing lines that reached toward measurements no builder had ever attempted. The tower would rise from the earth like a mountain made by human hands, its peak lost in clouds, its foundation broad enough to support the weight of heaven itself. "Higher," Nimrod commanded, his voice echoing through the planning chambers. "It must be higher than the mountains, higher than the birds fly, higher than the very throne of God." His advisors nodded eagerly, though some felt a chill run down their spines at such audacious words. They had grown used to their king's grand visions, but this project seemed to step beyond ambition into realms that mortals were not meant to explore. The first stones were laid with ceremony that drew spectators from across the known world. Priests from every nation blessed the foundation in their own tongues, calling upon their gods to favor the great work. Musicians played while workers sang, their voices rising in harmony that seemed to lift the very stones into place. The mood was festive, celebratory, full of the intoxicating belief that anything was possible when human will was properly focused. Brick by brick, the tower began its climb toward the sky. The workers developed a rhythm that matched the beating of their hearts, a steady pulse of construction that never ceased. Day and night, the building continued, torches providing light when the sun failed, braziers keeping the work warm when winter winds howled across the plain. The tower grew like a living thing, reaching always upward. The bricks themselves were a marvel of engineering, fired in kilns that burned with temperatures hot enough to melt bronze. Each one was perfectly shaped, marked with symbols that identified its maker, its place in the grand design. The mortar that held them together was mixed with substances that would make it harder than stone, more lasting than the mountains themselves. Ramps spiraled around the tower's exterior, allowing workers to carry materials to ever greater heights. Oxen pulled sledges loaded with bricks up these winding paths, their hooves wearing smooth grooves in the stone. Supply chains stretched back to quarries and kilns scattered across the kingdom, all focused on feeding the tower's insatiable appetite for materials. Nimrod climbed the ramps regularly, inspecting the work with the eye of a man who had never accepted second best in anything. He spoke to the workers in their own languages, encouraged them with promises of glory, reminded them that they were building something that would outlast the stars themselves. His presence energized the entire project, infusing it with the force of his personality. The tower's shadow fell across Babel like the hand of a sundial, marking time by its steady growth. Children played in that shadow, looking up with wonder at the structure that seemed to grow taller every day. Merchants conducted business in its shade, their voices mixing with the sounds of construction that had become the city's heartbeat. Years passed, and still the tower climbed. Workers who had begun the project as young men grew old on its heights, their sons taking up the tools when they could no longer lift them. Entire families devoted their lives to the great work, living in camps that moved up the tower's sides as the construction progressed ever skyward. The view from the tower's growing peak became legendary. Visitors climbed for days just to stand at its summit, looking out over a world that seemed to shrink beneath them. Rivers appeared as silver threads. Cities looked like toys scattered across a vast table. The curvature of the earth itself became visible to those brave enough to venture to the highest completed levels. Different languages had always been spoken in Babel's cosmopolitan streets, but they had never been a barrier to communication. Traders from distant lands had learned enough of each other's tongues to conduct business. Scholars had mastered multiple languages to share their knowledge. Love had found ways to bridge any gap between peoples who spoke different words for the same hopes and dreams. The confusion began subtly, like a fever that starts with the slightest chill. A foreman would give an order that his workers somehow misunderstood. An architect would explain a detail that somehow came out wrong in the listener's mind. At first, these miscommunications seemed like simple mistakes, easily corrected with patience and repetition. But the problem grew worse, spreading through the construction site like ripples in a disturbed pond. Words that had carried clear meaning yesterday sounded like gibberish today. Gestures that had always been understood now seemed foreign and strange. The common language that had united all the workers was fragmenting into dozens of separate tongues, each group finding itself isolated in a sea of incomprehensible voices. Panic replaced the steady rhythm of construction. Workers found themselves unable to communicate with their closest friends, their own family members. Fathers could not understand their sons. Wives could not speak to their husbands. The bonds that had held the great project together were dissolving as surely as if they had been made of salt left in the rain. Nimrod raged against the growing chaos, shouting orders that no one could comprehend. His words, which had once moved armies and inspired nations, now fell on ears that heard only meaningless noise. The tower that was meant to demonstrate human unity had become a monument to human division, its builders scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. The construction ground to a halt as workers abandoned their posts in confusion and fear. Tools lay scattered where they had been dropped by hands that could no longer coordinate their efforts. The great ramps that had carried materials skyward became highways of exodus as people fled the site in search of others who spoke languages they could understand. Groups formed along linguistic lines, families and clans discovering that they could still communicate among themselves while remaining cut off from their former neighbors. These groups began to migrate away from Babel, following the natural human impulse to seek out others who shared their newly distinct tongues. The great city that had been the center of the world watched its population scatter like seeds on the wind. The tower stood abandoned, its unfinished peak reaching toward heaven like an accusation or a prayer. Birds nested in its empty chambers. Vines began to climb its walls. The structure that was meant to last forever became a monument to the dangers of reaching too high, of confusing human ambition with divine prerogative. Nimrod himself became a figure of tragic legend, a king whose very success had carried the seeds of his downfall. He had united the world under his rule only to watch it fragment into countless separate peoples. He had dreamed of touching heaven, only to find that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed by mortal hands. The scattered peoples carried their memories of Babel with them as they spread across the earth. They told their children stories of the great tower, the mighty king, the day when language itself became a stranger. These tales varied in their details, but they all carried the same warning, that human pride, no matter how magnificently expressed, must ultimately bow before powers greater than itself. The plain where Babel had stood grew quiet, its markets empty, its streets echoing with the ghosts of vanished voices. The tower remained, weathering slowly under sun and rain, a reminder that even the greatest human achievements are temporary things, subject to the same forces that govern the rise and fall of empires, the flowering and fading of individual lives. The birth of Abram. In the city of Ur, where the ziggurats rose like man-made mountains toward the star-filled sky, the wise men studied their charts with growing unease. For weeks they had watched the heavens for signs and portents, reading messages in the dance of planets across the eternal dark. Tonight, something extraordinary was stirring in the cosmic patterns, something that made their aged hands tremble as they traced the ancient symbols. A new star blazed where no star had shone before, bright as a torch held against the face of night. It pulsed with light that seemed to carry meaning, rhythms that spoke of destiny being written in fire across the vault of heaven. The eldest among the watchers remembered prophecies handed down through generations, whispers of a child who would be born when the very stars rearranged themselves to herald his coming. King Nimrod felt the disturbance in his palace chambers, though he could not name what troubled his sleep. Dreams came to him in fragments, visions of a child whose eyes held starlight, whose small hands would somehow topple thrones and reshape the world. He woke with cold sweat on his brow, calling for his advisors, demanding explanations for the fear that gripped his heart like ice. The royal astronomers brought their calculations and their concerns, spreading star charts across the marble floors of the throne room. They spoke in hushed tones of celestial alignments that occurred once in 1,000 years, of signs that pointed to the birth of one who would challenge the very foundations of earthly power. Their words fell on the king's ears like prophecies of doom, confirming fears he had not dared to speak aloud. In a humble dwelling near the city's outskirts, Tara's wife felt the first pangs of labor as the mysterious star reached its zenith. She was past the age when most women bore children, her hair already touched with silver, her hands marked by years of honest work. Yet the child within her moved with strength that seemed to draw power from the very light that blazed overhead. The midwives who attended her spoke in whispers of strange things they witnessed that night. The room filled with warmth despite the winter cold outside. Shadows danced on the walls without any flame to cast them. The air itself seemed to shimmer with expectation, as if creation was holding its breath for the moment when this particular soul would enter the world. Tara paced outside the birthing chamber, his calloused hands working worry into the prayer beads his father had carved. He was a simple man who made idols for the temples, shaping clay and wood into forms that others worshipped. The irony was lost on him that night. The creator of false gods about to father a child who would spend his life proclaiming the reality of the one true God. The baby's first cry rang out just as the star reached its brightest point, a sound that seemed to harmonize with music none of them could quite hear. The midwives gasped as they lifted him, for his eyes were already open, gazing upward as if he could see through the roof to the cosmic drama playing out above. There was an ancient wisdom in that infant gaze, as if this newborn had brought memories of eternity with him into time. Tara held his son with trembling hands, amazed by the perfect features, the strong grip of tiny fingers that seemed to grasp not just his thumb, but something far more significant. Abram, he whispered, the name coming to him like a gift from beyond his understanding. His name is Abram. The syllables felt sacred on his tongue, heavy with promise he could not yet comprehend. The star that had announced the birth faded gradually over the following nights, returning the sky to its familiar patterns. But those who had witnessed its blazing presence never forgot the wonder of that celestial herald. They would speak of it in hushed tones for years to come, pointing to the place where it had burned and telling their children about the night. Heaven itself had declared that something extraordinary had entered the world. News of the unusual birth spread through Ur's narrow streets like ripples in still water. Neighbors came to see the child who had arrived under such remarkable signs, marveling at his alert eyes and quiet demeanor. Some brought gifts, grain and oil, simple toys carved from olive wood, blankets woven with protective symbols. Others came merely to look, drawn by curiosity about the baby whose birth had been marked by celestial fire. The wise men presented themselves at Tara's door on the 7th day, their robes dusty from traveling across the city to reach this humble quarter. They studied the infant with eyes trained to read destiny in the smallest signs, noting the shape of his hands, the set of his shoulders, the way he seemed to focus on things beyond the range of normal infant vision. Their conclusions troubled them deeply. "This child will be great among the nations," the eldest among them pronounced, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome prophecy. "Kings will fear him, though he commands no armies. His words will outlive empires, though he writes no books. He will father multitudes, though he begins with nothing." The others nodded gravely, recognizing truth in words that promised upheaval for the established order. Reports of these pronouncements reached Nimrod's court within hours, carried by servants who had overheard conversations they barely understood. The king's rage was terrible to witness. His fear transformed into fury that shook the very foundations of his palace. He summoned his generals and gave orders that would echo through history. Every male child born in Ur during the time of the star's appearance was to be found and killed. But the same power that had lit the star to herald Abram's birth also moved to protect the child from earthly malice. Dreams came to Terah in the watches of the night, visions of safety, hidden in the caves beyond the city walls. He woke his family before dawn, gathering their few possessions and the infant who slept peacefully despite the danger gathering around him like storm clouds. The cave where they found refuge had been carved from living rock by some ancient hand, its chambers deep enough to hide a family and dry enough to keep them comfortable. A spring bubbled up from the floor, providing fresh water. Dates and wild honey sustained them, gifts from a creation that seemed eager to protect this special child. Here, in the heart of the earth, Abram spent his first months while Nimrod's soldiers searched in vain through Ur's streets. The slaughter that followed was grievous to witness. Innocent blood spilled because of one king's fear of destiny written in the stars. Mothers wept over empty cradles. Fathers stood helpless as soldiers carried out orders that defied every instinct of mercy and justice. The city that had been proud of its prosperity and power learned that tyrants, when frightened, spare nothing in their attempts to forestall the future. Yet hidden in the cave, Abram grew strong and wise beyond his months. His mother sang to him songs her own mother had taught her, melodies that carried the memories of Noah's time, echoes of the world before the flood. His father told him stories of the ancient days, of righteousness and wickedness, of divine justice and human folly. The child listened with an attention that seemed supernatural in one so young. When it was finally safe to return to the city, the family that emerged from the cave was forever changed. Terah looked at his son with new eyes, recognizing that he was more custodian than father to this remarkable child. Abram's mother treated him with a reverence that mixed maternal love with prophetic awe. They had touched the edges of a story larger than their own lives, and they would never be quite the same. Abram himself grew like a tree planted by streams of living water, drawing strength from sources others could not see. His questions were deeper than those of other children, his insights sharper than seemed possible for his age. When he played with blocks of wood, he built not towers reaching toward heaven, but altars facing the earth, as if his very games were prayers offered to the God his heart was learning to recognize. The idol shop where his father worked became for the boy's first theological wrestling. He watched Terah shape clay and wood into forms that people would bow before, gods made by human hands to serve human desires. Something in Abram's spirit rebelled against this reversal of the proper order, this confusion of creator and creation that seemed to define the world around him. By his third year, Abram was asking questions that made the wisest men in Ur uncomfortable. Who made the gods? He would inquire with innocent directness that cut through centuries of religious tradition. If they are gods, why do they break when they fall? If they have power, why do they need Father to make them? Such questions had no good answers, and their very asking began to crack the foundations of beliefs his neighbors had never thought to examine. The star that had heralded his birth was gone from the sky, but its light seemed to have taken up residence in the child himself. There was an illumination in his presence that had nothing to do with lamps or torches, a clarity that made shadows flee and darkness seem suddenly fragile. Those who met him came away changed. though they could not always explain how or why. Abram and Nimrod's clash. The summons came on a morning when frost painted the windows like prophecy written in ice. A royal messenger stood at Terah's door, his purple cloak marking him as one who spoke with the king's own voice. "The boy Abram is commanded to appear before his majesty," he announced, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Today, at the hour when the sun reaches its peak." Terah's hands shook as he received the scroll bearing Nimrod's seal, that familiar image of the hunter with his bow drawn toward heaven. He had known this day would come, had felt it approaching like distant thunder that grows closer with each passing storm. His son, now 12 years old and already taller than most grown men, listened to the message with a calm that seemed far too mature for his years. "Do not fear, father," Abram said, placing his hand on Terah's shoulder with gentle strength. "The God who lit the star at my birth has not forgotten me now. Whatever comes today was planned before the foundations of the world were laid." His voice carried conviction that steadied his father's heart, though it could not chase away the worry that gathered like clouds before a tempest. The palace of Nimrod rose from the heart of like a mountain of worked stone and bronze, its towers reaching toward heaven with an arrogance that had grown more pronounced with each passing year. Guards in gleaming armor flanked every entrance. Their spears crossed in patterns that spoke of military precision and barely contained violence. The very air around the structure seemed heavy with the weight of power exercised without mercy. Abram walked through the palace corridors with his head held high, taking in the murals that depicted Nimrod's legendary hunts and conquests. Lions fell beneath the king's arrows. Cities surrendered at the approach of his armies. Even the gods of distant nations were shown bowing before his throne. The boy studied these images with interest rather than intimidation, as if he were reading a book whose ending he already knew. The throne room opened before them like a cavern carved from imagination and gold. Pillars thick as ancient trees supported a ceiling painted with scenes of cosmic dominion. The floor was a mosaic that told the story of Nimrod's rise to power, each tile placed with the precision of a master craftsman. At the room's far end, the throne itself waited like a judgment seat fashioned from the dreams of gods. Nimrod sat upon that throne with the easy confidence of one who had never known defeat, his massive frame draped in robes that caught the light like captured fire. His beard was black as midnight, his eyes sharp as the weapons that had made his reputation. When he looked at Abram, those eyes seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to examine the very soul beneath. "So," the king said, his voice rolling through the throne room like distant thunder, "this is the child who was born under the star, the one my wise men say will challenge thrones and topple kingdoms." He leaned forward slightly, studying Abram as a hunter might study prey before deciding whether it was worth pursuing. "You seem rather small to cause such mighty rulers such great concern." Abram stepped forward without fear, his young voice clear and strong in the vast space. "Your Majesty speaks of size as if it matters in the economy of heaven. Was not David small when he faced Goliath? Was not Moses slow of speech when he challenged Pharaoh? The God I serve measures hearts, not height. He counts faith, not physical strength." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers at such bold words from one so young. Nimrod's advisors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous ground that had suddenly opened beneath their feet. The king himself seemed momentarily taken aback by the boy's directness, his eyes narrowing as he processed this unexpected challenge to his authority. "The God you serve?" Nimrod asked, his tone growing sharper. "And which God might that be? I see no altar here, no image, no shrine. The gods of have temples that reach toward heaven. They have priests who offer sacrifices in their honor. They have power that men can see and touch. But your God seems to exist only in your imagination." Abram smiled with a serenity that seemed to glow in the torchlit chamber. "My God needs no temple made by human hands, for the whole earth is his dwelling place. He requires no image, for he made all things in his own image. He wants no sacrifice of beasts, for every creature belongs to him already. He is the God who spoke light into darkness, who breathed life into dust, who holds the stars in place with his word alone." The king's laughter boomed through the throne room, but there was no humor in it, only the harsh sound of power being mocked. Pretty words, boy, but words are wind unless backed by strength. Your invisible god may rule in your dreams, but here in the waking world, real power comes from real force. Observe how quickly your faith crumbles before actual fire. At Nimrod's gesture, guards seized Abram by his arms, their grip strong enough to leave bruises on softer flesh. But the boy did not struggle or cry out, did not plead for mercy or renounce his beliefs. Instead, he looked up at the king with eyes that held compassion rather than fear, pity rather than anger. You mistake the source of your strength, your majesty. The power you think you wield is only borrowed, and the true owner can reclaim it at any moment. The furnace had been prepared beforehand, its flames leaping high as temple priests fed it with oil and wood. The heat radiating from its mouth was intense enough to singe hair and clothing from several paces away. Nimrod's sorcerers chanted over the blaze, invoking their gods to make the fire burn hotter, to consume the flesh and bones of this young challenger to their king's authority. "Cast him in," Nimrod commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of flames and the drone of chanting. "Let us see if his God can deliver him from fire that burns hotter than the sun itself. Let us watch how quickly faith turns to ash when faced with real heat." The guards began to drag Abram toward the furnace mouth, expecting screams that never came. But as they approached the edge of that burning pit, something changed in the very nature of the fire itself. The flames that had raged moments before suddenly bent away from the furnace opening, as if pushed back by an invisible hand. The heat that had been unbearable now felt like a warm breeze on a summer evening. The roar of combustion gave way to something that sounded almost like music. Abram walked into the fire as easily as a man might enter his own garden, the flames parting before him like curtains drawn aside by unseen hands. Where the fire touched his clothing, it left no mark. Where it kissed his skin, it left no burn. He stood in the heart of the furnace as comfortably as if he were standing in a meadow, his face glowing with light that had nothing to do with the flames around him. The guards released their grip and stumbled backward, their courage evaporating like water thrown on hot stone. The priests stopped their chanting, their voices dying in throats suddenly gone dry with terror. Even Nimrod rose from his throne, his face pale beneath his dark beard, his hands gripping the arms of his seat until his knuckles showed white. From within the furnace, Abram's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying easily through the stunned silence of the throne room. "You see now, your majesty, the difference between gods made by human hands and the God who made human hands. Your fire has no power over those who belong to him. Your threats cannot touch those who trust in his protection." A figure appeared beside Abram in the flames, someone whose face shone with light too bright for mortal eyes to bear directly. The presence filled the furnace with a glory that made the fire itself seem dim by comparison. Those who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for what they had seen, always failing to capture the essence of that divine manifestation. The furnace door swung open of its own accord, and Abram emerged without so much as the smell of smoke on his garments. The flames died down to normal proportions behind him, once again becoming ordinary fire that burned according to natural laws. But everyone present knew they had witnessed something that transcended the natural order, something that challenged every assumption about power and authority. Nimrod stared at the young man who stood before his throne, no longer seeing a troublesome boy, but recognizing instead a force that could topple kingdoms without raising a sword. The star that had heralded Abram's birth now seemed like a warning rather than mere celestial coincidence. This child carried within him the power to reshape the world, and no earthly king could stand against such divine backing. "Go," Nimrod said finally, his voice hoarse with defeat he would never admit aloud. "Take your God and your faith and leave my kingdom. Never let me see your face again, for if you return, I will not be content with mere fire next time." His words carried the bitterness of a man who had discovered the limits of his own power, the boundaries beyond which human authority could not reach. Abram bowed respectfully before turning to leave, his manner courteous even in victory. "I go in peace, your majesty, carrying only goodwill toward you and your people. May you one day discover that the God who delivered me from your fire longs to deliver you from the burden of trying to be God yourself. With that, he walked from the throne room, leaving behind a king who would never again feel quite as secure on his throne. Abram's journey begins. The voice came in the deep watches of the night, when the world lay wrapped in darkness and only the stars bore witness to the sacred conversation about to unfold. Abram woke not with a start, but with the gradual awareness of one who has been expecting an important visitor. The presence that filled his tent was both awesome and intimate, terrible and gentle, carrying with it the weight of eternity and the warmth of perfect love. Leave this place, the voice said, its tones resonating through flesh and bone to reach the deepest chambers of Abram's heart. Leave your country, your people, your father's household. Go to the land I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. Abram rose from his sleeping mat and stepped outside into the starlit courtyard, his eyes lifted toward the vast canopy of heaven that seemed suddenly closer than ever before. The same stars that had announced his birth now witnessed this moment of calling, this divine invitation to abandon everything familiar and step into a future known only to God. His heart raced with excitement and terror in equal measure. Sarah stirred as he returned to the tent, her intuition sensing the change that had come over her husband, even in sleep. She opened her eyes to find him kneeling beside their bed, his face illuminated by moonlight that seemed to carry its own sacred glow. "What is it?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his trembling hand. "You look as if you have seen angels." "Perhaps I have," Abram replied, his voice hushed with wonder. "The God who delivered me from Nimrod's fire has spoken again. He calls us to leave Ur, to abandon everything we know and follow him to a land we have never seen. He promises to make of us a great nation, though we have no children. He vows to bless all the earth through our descendants, though our tent is empty of the laughter of little ones." Sarah sat up slowly, her mind wrestling with words that seemed to defy every practical consideration. They were no longer young, their hair already touched with silver, their hopes for children long since buried beneath the weight of passing years. Yet something in her husband's voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made her heart leap with an answering faith. "When do we leave?" she asked simply, her question carrying within it a surrender that would echo through generations yet unborn. In those 4 words, she joined her destiny to his, her faith to his faith, her future to the mysterious plan that was unfolding around them like morning breaking over distant mountains. The preparations began at dawn, though there seemed little enough to prepare. A lifetime of accumulated possessions suddenly looked like meaningless clutter when weighed against the magnitude of their calling. Abram sorted through his belongings with the ruthless efficiency of one who has seen the difference between treasure and trash, keeping only what was essential for the journey ahead. Servants loaded the camels with tents and provisions, water skins and cooking pots, the basic necessities that would sustain them in the wilderness. The flocks that constituted their wealth were gathered and counted, hundreds of sheep and goats that would accompany them on their migration to unknown lands. Each animal represented security, prosperity, a hedge against the uncertainties of nomadic life. Terah approached his son as the caravan took shape, his aged face marked by sorrow and pride in equal measure. "I raised you to follow in my footsteps," he said, gesturing toward the workshop where clay gods still waited to be finished. "I hoped you would inherit my business, marry my customers' daughters, give me grandchildren to dandle on my knee. Instead, you chase after invisible gods and impossible promises." Abram embraced his father with gentle strength, understanding the grief that lay beneath the criticism. "The God who calls me is not invisible to those who have eyes to see," he replied softly. "His promises are not impossible to those who have learned to trust his power. Come with us, Father. Leave the gods made by your hands and discover the God who made your hands." But Terah shook his head, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I am too old to learn new ways, too set in my patterns to follow strange paths. My roots have grown too deep in this soil to be transplanted now. Go with my blessing, my son, but know that my heart breaks to see you leave." The old man pressed a small carved figure into Abram's palm, a traveling god meant to protect journeys, then turned away before his tears could shame him. Lot appeared at Abram's elbow as the final preparations neared completion, his young face bright with excitement and determination. "Uncle, I would come with you if you will have me," he said, his voice steady despite his youth. "My father is dead. My mother follows her own path. You have been more than family to me. You have been my teacher in the ways of faith. Let me learn from you how to follow this God who speaks from heaven." The sight of his nephew's eager face stirred something deep in Abram's heart, a warmth that felt like a foretaste of the children he and Sarah had never been able to conceive. "Come then," he said, placing his hand on Lot's shoulder. "The road is long and the destination unknown, but we travel under the protection of the Most High. Your company will lighten the journey, and your faith will strengthen our own." The caravan that finally departed stretched across the desert like a living river, hundreds of people and thousands of animals moving in stately procession toward horizons that shimmered with heat and possibility. Word had spread through the city of Abram's divine calling, and many had chosen to attach themselves to his household, drawn by stories of the God who had delivered him from fire and now promised to lead him to blessing. Behind them, the great city of gradually faded into the desert haze, its towers and temples becoming mere shadows against the sky. Ahead lay wilderness and wandering, uncertainty and adventure, the slow unfolding of promises too large for mortal minds to fully grasp. Abram rode at the head of the procession, his eyes fixed on the path before him, his heart anchored to the voice that had called him into this strange pilgrimage. The desert tested them from the first day, its heat pressing down like a heavy hand, its vastness threatening to swallow their small caravan without a trace. Water became precious, shade a luxury. The simple act of putting one foot in front of another, an act of faith renewed with each step. Yet through it all, Abram pressed forward with unwavering determination, guided by an inner compass that pointed always toward the fulfillment of divine promise. Nights brought relief from the sun's punishment, but presented their own challenges. Wild animals prowled the edges of their camps, their eyes reflecting the light of the fires that kept the darkness at bay. Bandits watched from hidden places, calculating the strength of the caravan's guards against the value of its wealth. Yet somehow protection always appeared when danger threatened, as if invisible hands were smoothing their path through the wilderness. The first oasis appeared like a miracle of green in the endless brown, its palm trees swaying in the breeze, its spring bubbling up from depths that spoke of divine provision. The caravan rested there for 3 days, allowing both people and animals to drink deeply, to bathe away the dust of travel, to remember what it felt like to be cool and comfortable. It was there, beside the peaceful water, that Abram built his first altar in the land of promise. The stones came together under his hands as if they had been waiting for centuries to fulfill this purpose, each one fitting perfectly into the growing structure. When the fire descended from heaven to consume his sacrifice, every member of the caravan knew they were witnessing something beyond the ordinary course of nature. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying with it prayers and thanksgiving that seemed to find their target in the heart of heaven itself. Abram knelt beside the altar with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the goodness of a God who had led him safely through the desert to this place of rest and refreshment. The journey was far from over, but already he could see the faithfulness of the one who had called him. "This is only the beginning," he whispered to Sarah as they watched the fire die down to glowing coals. "We have left much behind, but we are walking toward blessings we cannot yet imagine. The God who spoke the worlds into existence has chosen to write our names into his story. What greater honor could any mortal hope to receive?" Sarah took her husband's hand and squeezed it gently, her own heart full of wonder at the path they had chosen. The road ahead remained uncertain, the promised land still hidden beyond distant horizons. But they were no longer the same people who had left Ur's gates behind them. They were pilgrims now, marked by heaven, called to a destiny that would echo through the ages yet to come. The War of the Kings. The messenger who brought news of Lot's capture rode his horse nearly to death in his desperate race across the desert. His robes were torn by thorns, his face blackened by sun and wind, his eyes wild with the terror of what he had witnessed. He fell from his mount at the entrance to Abram's camp, gasping for water and struggling to form words that would convey the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the cities of the plain. Gone, he managed to say between gulps of cool water. Sodom, Gomorrah, all of them. The armies of the eastern kings swept down like locusts, taking everything, everyone. Your nephew fought bravely, but the numbers were too great. They have taken him north toward Damascus, along with all the wealth of the cities and hundreds of captives. Abram's blood turned to ice in his veins as he listened to the details of the raid. 4 great kings had allied themselves together: Chedorlaomer of Elam, Tidal of Goim, Amraphel of Shinar, and Arioch of Elasar. Their combined armies had been virtually unstoppable, crushing resistance wherever they found it, gathering loot and slaves as they marched triumphantly toward their distant kingdoms. The strategic mind that had once counseled patience in Nimrod's court now shifted into the cold calculations of warfare. Abram studied the rough map the messenger had scratched in the sand, noting the likely routes the enemy would take, the places where they might be vulnerable, the timing that would be required to mount any sort of rescue attempt. The odds were impossible, but impossibility had never stopped him before. "How many men do they have?" he asked, his voice calm despite the rage that burned in his chest. The messenger's answer made several of the listening servants gasp in dismay. Thousands upon thousands of hardened warriors, veterans of campaigns that had conquered nations. Battle-tested cavalry and infantry, siege engines and supply trains, the full military might of the greatest powers in the known world. "And how many do we have?" asked Eliezer, Abram's most trusted servant, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would not be encouraging. Abram looked around at the men who had followed him from Ur, farmers and shepherds mostly, brave enough in their own way, but hardly a match for professional soldiers who had spent their lives perfecting the arts of war. "We have 318 trained men," Abram replied, his voice carrying a confidence that seemed to flow from some inner source of strength. "More importantly, we have the promise of the God who delivered me from Nimrod's fire, who brought us safely through the desert, who has never failed to keep his word. If he is for us, numbers become meaningless." The preparations began immediately. Weapons drawn from storage and sharpened to gleaming edges, armor checked and adjusted, strategies discussed and refined. Abram's household had always maintained a small force of fighting men, guards against the bandits and wild animals that threatened nomadic life. Now that force would be asked to face the finest military units in the ancient world. Mamre the Amorite came with his brothers, bringing their own warriors to join the desperate expedition. These men had sworn blood brotherhood with Abram, bonds that held stronger than gold or political convenience. They knew the mission was likely suicidal, but friendship demanded that they share whatever fate awaited the man who had become closer than family to them. The forced march that followed tested the limits of human endurance. Men and horses pushed to speeds that burned through energy reserves like fire through dry grass. They traveled by night when possible, following paths known only to desert dwellers, cutting across terrain that would slow the heavy baggage trains of the retreating enemy. Every mile covered was a small victory against the growing distance between them and their quarry. Scouts ranged ahead and to the sides, gathering intelligence about enemy movements, searching for signs of the massive column that was dragging so many innocent captives towards slavery in foreign lands. The trail was easy enough to follow. Thousands of feet and hooves left marks that even amateur trackers could read, and the devastation left behind spoke eloquently of the army's passage. They caught their first glimpse of the enemy camp as the sun was setting behind the hills near Dan, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed like an omen of the blood about to be shed. The sight that met their eyes was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because the army was clearly relaxed, confident in their security, unprepared for any serious threat. Terrifying because even this close view confirmed the messenger's estimate of their overwhelming numbers. The camp sprawled across the valley like a temporary city. Thousands of tents arranged in orderly rows, cook fires sending columns of smoke into the evening air, sentries posted with the casual efficiency of men who had no reason to expect trouble. The captives were held in a roped enclosure near the center of the camp, close enough to the main force that rescue would require fighting through the heart of the enemy position. Abram divided his tiny force into 4 groups, each tasked with attacking from a different direction simultaneously. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Create enough confusion and panic to make the enemy think they were facing a much larger force, strike hard and fast at the captive enclosure, then withdraw before the superior numbers could be brought to bear effectively. "We have one advantage they cannot overcome," he told his men as they prepared for the assault. "They fight for plunder and glory, temporary things that will be forgotten when they die. We fight for family and justice, for the honor of the God who sees every sparrow's fall. They may be more numerous, but we are more motivated. Tonight, righteousness rides with us into battle." The attack began at midnight, when the enemy camp was deepest in sleep and the guards most likely to be drowsy at their posts. War cries echoed from 4 directions at once, seeming to multiply in the darkness until it sounded as if an entire army was descending on the unprepared kings. Torches flared to life as confused soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing for weapons and trying to understand what was happening. Abram led the central assault himself. His sword, cutting through opposition like lightning, splits the sky. Men who had never seen him fight watched in amazement as their elderly patriarch moved with the speed and skill of a warrior half his age. It was as if the same divine power that had protected him in Nimrod's furnace now guided his blade and strengthened his arm for this work of rescue. The captive enclosure fell quickly to their coordinated assault, ropes cut and guards overwhelmed before they could raise an effective alarm. Lot emerged from the crowd of prisoners, his face bloody but his spirit unbroken, immediately grabbing a sword from a fallen enemy and throwing himself into the fight alongside his uncle. Together, they carved a path through the chaos toward the edge of the camp. The retreat was as carefully planned as the attack, each group following predetermined routes that would confuse pursuit and prevent the enemy from concentrating their superior forces. They scattered into the hills like ghosts, carrying their rescued captives and much of the enemy's treasure, leaving behind them a camp in uproar and 4 very angry kings, demanding to know how a handful of nomads had made fools of their mighty armies. The pursuit that followed was half-hearted and poorly organized, hampered by the darkness and the unfamiliar terrain. By dawn, Abram's forces had put enough distance between themselves and the enemy to feel relatively safe. The rescued captives wept with gratitude. The recovered treasure glittered in the morning sun, and the impossible had once again been accomplished through faith and courage, working hand in hand. But the true significance of the victory would only become clear when they met the mysterious priest-king who waited for them in the valley near Salem. Melchizedek's blessing would transform what might have been merely a successful raid into a pivotal moment in the unfolding story of divine purpose, a chapter that would be remembered and retold for thousands of years to come. The binding of Isaac. In the quiet hours before dawn, a voice calls to Abraham, the same voice that led him from his homeland years before. Now it speaks a command that tears at the very heart of faith. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you. The book of Jasher tells us Abraham's heart nearly stopped. This was Isaac, the miracle child born when Sarah was 90, the son through whom nations would be blessed, the living proof of God's promise. Yet Abraham rises before sunrise, splits wood for the offering, and saddles his donkey. No argument, no negotiation, just quiet obedience. Sarah sleeps as they depart. Jasher reveals she knew nothing of this journey's true purpose. Abraham told her only that he would take Isaac to study the ways of the Lord. She blessed their departure with a mother's gentle kiss on Isaac's forehead. Neither father nor son spoke of what lay ahead on the mountain. The journey to Moriah takes 3 days. Father and son walk side by side, their servants trailing behind with supplies. Isaac, now 37 years old, notices his father's unusual silence. The man who once negotiated with God for Sodom's sake now speaks only when necessary. His eyes hold a weight that seems to press down on his shoulders. On the second evening, they rest beside a flowing stream. Isaac watches his father stare into the dancing flames of their campfire. "Father," he says softly, "you seem troubled." Abraham looks at his son, this miracle of his old age, and nearly weeps. "The Lord tests us in ways we cannot understand," he whispers. "But his will is perfect, even when our hearts cannot see it." The third day arrives with unusual clarity. The sky stretches endlessly blue, unmarked by clouds. Abraham sees the mountain in the distance, and his hands tremble as he points toward it. "There," he tells his servants, "stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go and worship, and we will return to you." Jasher notes the faith in those words. Abraham believes somehow, impossibly, that both will return. Father and son climb alone. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. Isaac bears the wood on his shoulders, walking with steady steps up the rocky path. The silence grows heavy between them until Isaac speaks. "Father, I see the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's voice catches. "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." These words, spoken with such certainty, reveal a faith that transcends human understanding. He believes in resurrection, in divine intervention, in purposes beyond mortal sight. They reach the chosen spot as the sun climbs higher. Abraham's hands shake as he builds the altar, stone upon stone, each piece placed with the care of one who knows this moment will echo through eternity. Isaac watches, understanding dawning slowly in his eyes. When the altar stands complete, his father turns to him with tears streaming down his weathered face. "My son," Abraham whispers, "the Lord has commanded that you be offered as a sacrifice." Isaac could run, he could fight, he could call for help. Instead, he bows his head. "Father, do all that the Lord has spoken to you. I am ready." Jasher tells us Isaac's willing heart made him as great as his father in this moment. Abraham's hands tremble as he binds Isaac's arms and legs, not tightly, for he cannot bear to cause pain, but securely as the law requires. Isaac lies still on the wood, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. The morning sun bathes the mountaintop in golden light, as if heaven itself watches this supreme test of faith. The knife rises in Abraham's hand. It catches the sunlight, flashing like a star. His arm trembles with the weight of this impossible command. Below, Isaac waits with the patience of perfect trust. Around them, the world holds its breath. Even the wind stops blowing across the mountain peaks. Then the angel's voice splits the silence like thunder. "Abraham! Abraham! Do not lay your hand on the boy, or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The knife falls from Abraham's hand, clattering against the stones. Father and son weep together as the ropes fall away. Behind them, caught in a thicket by its horns, stands a ram, God's provision appearing at the exact moment of need. Abraham's faith is vindicated. Isaac's willingness is honored. The test is complete. They offer the ram together, its smoke rising straight up in the still air. Abraham names the place the Lord will provide, and Jasher tells us this name echoes still in the hills of Moriah. As they descend the mountain, Isaac walks differently. The boy who climbed up has become a man of faith on the way down. Sarah waits at home, her heart somehow knowing that everything has changed. When they return, she sees it in their faces, the shared secret of ultimate trust, the bond forged in fire and proven in obedience. Abraham tells her everything, and she weeps not from sorrow, but from awe at the God who provides. This mountain becomes sacred ground. Generations later, Solomon will build his temple here. The altar where Isaac lay willing will become the place where thousands of sacrifices rise to heaven. What began as a test of one man's faith becomes the foundation for a nation's worship. The binding of Isaac reveals the heart of faith itself, not the absence of questioning, but trust beyond understanding. Not the lack of fear, but obedience despite trembling. Both father and son passed through fire and emerged transformed. Their relationship with God deepened beyond words. Jasher reminds us that some stories shape us even in their telling. This tale of mountain and altar, knife and ram, father and son, speaks to something eternal in the human spirit. It whispers that ultimate trust leads to ultimate provision, that God's tests are also God's gifts, and that the hardest paths often lead to the greatest revelations. Isaac's life and struggles. The years flow gently after Mount Moriah. Isaac grows into manhood marked by that mountain experience, be it carrying its lessons like treasures in his heart. Yet life offers him new challenges, fresh tests that shape his character in different ways. The book of Jasher paints his story with quiet colors, showing us a man who finds his strength in stillness rather than action. Sarah passes away when Isaac reaches 40, her death casting long shadows over Abraham's tent. She dies peacefully in Hebron, her last words a blessing over her miracle son. Isaac mourns deeply, for she was not just his mother but his first teacher in faith. Her laughter had filled his childhood, her wisdom had guided his youth. Now silence settles where her voice once brought joy. Abraham, now ancient but still vigorous, seeks a wife for Isaac, not from the daughters of Canaan, but from his own people in Mesopotamia. He calls his most trusted servant and places this sacred task in his hands. "Go to my country and my relatives," he commands, "and take a wife for my son Isaac." The servant accepts this mission with solemn reverence. Meanwhile, Isaac retreats off into the fields for prayer and meditation. Jasher tells us he spends hours in quiet communion with God, his spirit growing deep like roots seeking water. The servants notice his gentle nature, how he speaks kindly to everyone, how he treats animals with tenderness. His father's fire burns differently in him, steady and warm rather than blazing. The servant returns with Rebekah, and Isaac's heart awakens to love. She is beautiful, yes, but more than that, she carries the same faith that marked his family. When they meet in the field at evening, something passes between them beyond words. Isaac sees in her eyes the same trust that held him still on Moriah's altar. She sees in him the gentleness that comes from knowing God's provision. Their marriage brings healing to the household. Rebekah's laughter fills the spaces where Sarah's voice once echoed. Isaac finds in her not just a wife, but a companion for his soul. They walk together in the cool of evening, sharing dreams and hopes. Their love grows slowly, like plants reaching towards sunlight, rooted in something deeper than passion. Yet the years pass without children. Rebekah's womb remains closed, month after month, year after year. Isaac watches his wife's face shadow with each disappointment. The promise made to Abraham seems distant now. How can nations come from a man whose wife bears no children? The silence of their tent grows heavy with unspoken longings. Isaac does what his father taught him. He prays, not once or twice, but persistently, bringing his wife's barrenness before the Lord year after year. Jasher tells us his prayers are gentle but constant, like water wearing smooth a stone. He pleads not with desperation, but with quiet confidence in God's timing. 20 years pass before God opens Rebekah's womb. When pregnancy comes at last, it brings unexpected struggles. The children fight within her, their movements so violent that Rebekah fears for her life. She seeks the Lord's guidance and receives a prophecy that shapes their future. 2 nations wrestle in her womb. The older will serve the younger. The twins arrive like thunder after long silence. Esau emerges first, red and hairy, his grip on life immediate and fierce. Jacob follows, his hand clutching his brother's heel, already showing the determination that will mark his path. Isaac holds them both, these living proof of God's faithfulness, and his heart overflows with gratitude. As the boys grow, Isaac's parental heart splits between them. Esau becomes his favorite, the hunter who brings him savory game. Jacob prefers the tents, staying close to his mother, learning the deeper things of faith. Isaac loves them both, but differently, not seeing how this division will tear his family apart. The years bring prosperity despite periodic famines. Isaac digs wells where his father once dug, reopening the sources of living water. The Philistines fill them with earth out of envy, but Isaac digs again and again, his patience outlasting their opposition. Each well becomes a testimony to persistence, each flowing stream a sign of God's provision. His gentle nature sometimes seems like weakness to others. When Abimelech's men quarrel over water rights, Isaac moves on rather than fight. His servants question this decision, but Isaac understands something they miss. Peace costs less than conflict. Patience achieves more than force. His willingness to yield wins him greater respect than fighting ever could. The famine years test his faith differently than they tested Abraham's. Where his father traveled to Egypt, Isaac remains in Canaan, trusting God's specific command to stay. He plants crops when others hoard grain and harvests a hundredfold blessing. His faith expresses itself through staying rather than going, through constancy rather than movement. Age brings new challenges. Isaac's eyes grow dim, his hearing weak. The active years fade into memory. Yet his spirit remains strong, his relationship with God deeper than ever. The man who once lay willing on an altar now rests in the certainty of the divine love. His quiet strength becomes a foundation for his son's more dramatic stories. Rebecca grows old beside him, her beauty deepening into grace. They sit together in their tent's doorway, watching their twin sons grow into men. Neither knows the deception that approaches, the plan that will divide their family. For now, there is only the peace of evening, the satisfaction of a life lived in faith. Isaac's story teaches us that heroism takes many forms. Not every man must challenge kings or build altars. Some are called to patience, to constancy, to the quiet faithfulness that digs wells and trusts God's timing. His legacy lives not in dramatic actions, but in steady obedience, not in conquering enemies, but in conquering doubt. The book of Jasher shows us Isaac as a bridge between his father's blazing faith and his son's complex struggles. He inherits Abraham's trust, but expresses it through gentleness. He passes on the promise through quiet confidence rather than bold action. In him, we see that God's purposes advance through many kinds of people, that the kingdom of heaven includes both mountain climbers and well diggers. Jacob and Esau. The tent of Isaac holds a secret tension that grows with each passing year. Twin sons, born from the same womb, develop into men as different as fire and water. Esau runs wild in the fields, his bow always ready, his heart beating with the rhythm of the hunt. Jacob stays close to home, his hands gentle with the flocks, his mind turning toward deeper things. The book of Jasher reveals how this difference, meant to show God's varied gifts, becomes instead a source of division. Esau returns from hunting one day, his stomach empty, his strength nearly spent. The scent of Jacob's lentil stew fills the air like a promise of comfort. "Let me eat some of that red stew," he gasps, "for I am exhausted." His brother looks up from stirring the pot, and something passes between them in that moment, an opportunity, a choice that will echo through generations. "Sell me your birthright first," Jacob says quietly. The words hang in the air like smoke from the cooking fire. Esau laughs, but there's no humor in it. "I'm about to die of hunger. What good is a birthright to me?" He speaks carelessly, as if trading away his inheritance means nothing more than exchanging a worn sandal. The oath is sworn over a bowl of stew. Esau eats with the urgency of a man who thinks only of the present moment. Jacob watches, knowing he has just changed the course of their family's future. Jasher tells us neither brother fully understands what has happened. One thinks he has gained a meal, the other believes he has secured his destiny. Years pass. Isaac grows old, his eyes dimming until shadows replace the clear sight of youth. He feels death approaching like evening after a long day. The time comes to pass on the great blessing, the promise given to Abraham and meant for his firstborn son. Isaac calls Esau to him, his voice gentle with fatherly love. "My son, I am old and do not know the day of my death. Take your weapons, your quiver and bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Prepare for me the kind of tasty food I love and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Esau's heart swells with joy. Finally, the moment he has waited for all his life. But Rebecca listens from behind the tent wall, her heart racing with protective fear. She knows the prophecy spoken before her son's birth. The older will serve the younger. If Isaac blesses Esau, will God's plan be thwarted? She acts swiftly, calling Jacob to her side with urgent whispers. "Your father is about to bless Esau," she tells him. "Listen carefully to what I say." Her plan unfolds quickly. Jacob will bring savory food to his father. He will cover his smooth skin with goat hair and wear Esau's clothes. In his father's darkness, he will receive the blessing meant for his brother. Jacob's heart pulls in two directions. My brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am smooth. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself rather than a blessing. Yet his mother's determination overcomes his doubts. Let any curse fall on me, my son, she whispers. Just obey my voice. The deception unfolds with careful precision. Jacob dresses in Esau's clothes, the scent of fields and hunt clinging to the fabric. The goat's skins cover his hands and neck. Rebekah prepares the food exactly as Isaac loves it. Everything is ready except Jacob's heart, which beats like a drum against his ribs. He approaches his father's bedside, his voice carefully modulated. My father. Isaac turns toward the sound, confusion clouding his features. Here I am. Who are you, my son? The question hangs between them like a bridge Jacob must cross. I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat of my game that you may bless me. Isaac's suspicion stirs. How did you find it so quickly, my son? Jacob's answer comes too smoothly. Because the Lord your God brought it to me. The old man's heart troubles him. Something feels wrong, but he cannot grasp what it might be. Come near, that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. Jacob's hands tremble as his father's fingers explore his skin. The goat hair convinces the touch, but Isaac's heart still wavers. The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. The blessing flows from Isaac's lips like water from a spring. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you and blessed be everyone who blesses you. Jacob receives the words that will shape his destiny, but they taste bitter on his tongue. He has gained what he wanted through deception, and the victory feels hollow. As he leaves his father's presence, Esau's footsteps echo outside the tent. The hunter returns, unaware that his future has been stolen while he pursued game in the fields. The truth explodes like lightning in a clear sky. Esau prepares his father's favorite meal and brings it eagerly to the tent. Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. Isaac's confusion deepens into horror. Who are you? He asks, though he already knows. I am your son, your firstborn Esau. The old man trembles violently. Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. The words fall like stones into still water, sending ripples of realization through Esau's heart. Bless me, even me also, O my father. Esau's cry tears through the tent like a wounded animal's howl. He weeps with the sound of a man whose world has crumbled. Isaac's heart breaks for his favorite son, but the blessing cannot be recalled. Your brother came deceitfully, he whispers, and he has taken away your blessing. Esau's grief transforms into rage. Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. His voice grows dangerous. Have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac offers what he can, but it is only scraps compared to what Jacob has received. Hatred grows in Esau's heart like a poisonous plant. The days of mourning for my father are approaching, he tells himself. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. The words burn in his chest, fed by years of rivalry and this final betrayal. Murder seems the only way to balance the scales. Rebekah learns of the threat and acts to protect her favored son. She sends Jacob away to her brother Laban in Mesopotamia, telling Isaac it is to find a wife among their own people. Jacob flees like a thief in the night, carrying his stolen blessing, but leaving behind everything else he has ever known. The family Isaac built through patience and prayer fractures along the lines of favoritism and deception. Jasher reveals the cost of choices made in darkness, the price of grasping for what God might have given freely. 2 brothers, once sharing the same womb, now live as enemies, their paths diverging toward different destinies. Yet even in this brokenness, God's purposes advance. Jacob, the deceiver, will become Israel, the wrestler with God. Esau, the hunter, will father the Edomites. Their conflict will echo through history, but so will their eventual reconciliation. Sometimes God's plans unfold through human failure as well as human faith, weaving even our mistakes into patterns of grace. Joseph's dream and betrayal. In the tents of Jacob, now called Israel, peace settles like evening shadows after years of struggle. The old man has 12 sons, each one a future tribe, but his heart holds special tenderness for Joseph. Born to his beloved Rachel in their later years, this son carries himself differently from his brothers. He walks with quiet dignity, speaks with unusual wisdom, and dreams dreams that seem to come from heaven itself. Joseph's coat catches sunlight like a rainbow, its many colors telling everyone who sees it that he is favored above his brothers. Jacob crafted it with his own hands, each thread woven with love, each hue chosen with care. The brothers watch him wear it, and their hearts grow dark with envy. Why should the youngest among them receive such honor? Why should their father's love fall so unevenly? The book of Jasher tells us Joseph's dreams begin when he turns 17. They come to him in the deep of night, vivid as waking visions, clear as prophecy. In the first dream, he and his brothers work in the field, binding grain into sheaves. His sheaf rises and stands upright while theirs bow down around it, as if worshiping at an altar. He shares the dream at breakfast, his voice bright with wonder. "Listen to this dream I had," he says, not seeing how his brothers' faces harden. "We were binding sheaves of grain in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The words fall into silence heavy as stones. "Do you intend to reign over us?" His brother Judah asks, his voice sharp with anger. "Will you actually rule us?" They hear in Joseph's innocent telling a claim to supremacy, a declaration of future dominance. The seed of hatred planted by favoritism begins to sprout in soil watered by jealousy. The second dream comes soon after, even more troubling than the first. Joseph sees the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him in a sky blazing with supernatural light. This vision he shares not just with his brothers, but with his father, and even Jacob's face shows concern. "What is this dream you have dreamed?" he asks. "Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" Jacob rebukes his son gently, but Jasher tells us he keeps these words in his heart, pondering their meaning. Could God be speaking through his beloved boy? The old man has wrestled with angels and received divine promises. He knows the voice of heaven when he hears it, even filtered through a young man's dreams. The brothers' hatred deepens with each passing day. They see how their father sends Joseph to check on them when they graze the flocks in distant fields. They hear the questions he asks, the reports he brings back. In their minds, he becomes not a loving brother, but a spy, watching their every move, carrying tales back to their father's ears. "Here comes this dreamer," they mutter when they see him approaching across the fields. The colorful coat flutters in the wind like a banner of their father's favoritism. Their hearts burn with resentment that has grown too large for their chests to contain. Something must be done about this boy who dreams of ruling over them. The opportunity comes when Jacob sends Joseph to find his brothers near Dothan. They see him from far off, a small figure against the vast landscape, and their anger crystallizes into deadly purpose. "Come now," says one of them, "let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. We can say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what comes of his dreams." But Reuben, the eldest, pulls back from the edge of murder. "Let us not take his life," he says, hoping to save his young brother. "Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." He plans to rescue Joseph secretly and return him to their father. Yet even good intentions can pave roads to unexpected destinations. Joseph approaches his brothers with joy in his heart, unaware of the storm gathering around him. He calls out greetings, eager to share news from home. They rush upon him like wolves, their hands rough with accumulated rage. The beautiful coat tears under their grasping fingers, its colors mingling as they strip it from his body. "Please, my brothers," Joseph cries, but they are beyond hearing please. Years of jealousy pour out in violence. They seize him and throw him into the empty pit, its walls too steep for climbing, its depth too great for escape. He lands hard on the rocky bottom, his voice echoing in the darkness as he calls their names. They sit down to eat while their brothers' cries rise from the pit like smoke from a sacrifice. The bread tastes like dust in their mouths, but they chew mechanically, trying to silence the voice of conscience. Some dreams, they tell themselves, deserve to die in darkness. A caravan appears on the horizon, merchants heading toward Egypt with spices and precious goods. Judah looks up from his meal, and a different plan begins to form. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to these traders and not lay our hand upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." The transaction happens quickly. 20 pieces of silver change hands, and Joseph becomes property rather than family. The merchants pull him from the pit, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My brothers," he whispers, "but Chains are already being fastened around his wrists. The caravan moves on, carrying him toward a future none of them can imagine. They slaughter a goat and dip Joseph's coat in its blood, the beautiful colors now stained dark with deception. The fabric that once proclaimed their father's love now speaks only of tragedy. They return home with faces schooled in grief, carrying the bloody coat like evidence of their sorrow. "We found this," they tell Jacob, their voices carefully modulated. "Please examine it to see whether it is your son's robe or not." The old man's hands tremble as he recognizes the coat he made with such care. "It is my son's robe," he whispers. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob's grief fills the tent like floodwaters, washing away everything in its path. He tears his clothes and wraps himself in sackcloth, mourning for his beloved son with an intensity that frightens his family. "I will go down to the grave mourning for my son," he declares, and no comfort they offer can reach him in his sorrow. The brothers watch their father weep and feel the weight of their deeds settle on their shoulders like a burden they cannot cast off. They thought killing Joseph would end his dreams, but instead those dreams seem to have come alive, haunting them day and night. They cannot escape the memory of his voice calling from the pit, cannot forget the look in his eyes as the caravan carried him away. Jasher reminds us that some actions create ripples that spread far beyond their source. The brothers' jealousy, meant to preserve their own standing, has shattered their family's peace. Joseph's dreams, which they tried to destroy, will unfold in ways they never imagined. God's purposes move forward even through human sin, weaving patterns of redemption from threads of betrayal. The dreamer travels toward Egypt in chains, but his dreams travel with him, seeds of destiny that will bloom in foreign soil. What his brothers meant for evil, God will use for good. What they destroyed in anger, heaven will restore in grace. The boy who dreamed of ruling will indeed become a ruler, but not in the way any of them expected. Joseph in Egypt. The dust of the Egyptian road clings to Joseph's feet as the caravan approaches Memphis. Chains bind his wrists, but they cannot shackle his spirit. The young man who once wore a coat of many colors now wears the rough garments of a slave, yet something in his bearing suggests nobility that bondage cannot diminish. The book of Jasher tells us he prays as he walks, finding strength in the God of his fathers, even in this foreign land. The slave market buzzes with activity under the scorching sun. Bodies are examined like livestock, muscles tested, teeth inspected. Joseph stands straighter than the others, his eyes clear despite his circumstances. When Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard, approaches, something in the young Hebrew's face catches his attention. This one is different. This one carries himself like a son of kings. Potiphar's house becomes Joseph's world, and he transforms it through simple faithfulness. Given charge of a single task, he completes it with excellence. Trusted with greater responsibility, he proves worthy of confidence. The Egyptian watches his new slave with growing amazement. Everything Joseph touches prospers. Every project he oversees succeeds beyond expectation. "The Lord was with Joseph," Jasher explains, "and he became a successful man." Success follows him like a faithful dog, not because he seeks it, but because he serves with genuine heart. His master's wealth increases. His master's household runs with smooth efficiency. Other servants look to Joseph for guidance, sensing the wisdom that flows from his quiet confidence. Potiphar recognizes divine favor when he sees it. This Hebrew boy carries blessing in his hands, brings prosperity wherever he goes. Soon Joseph oversees the entire household, managing vast estates and considerable wealth. He moves through the house like its true master, making decisions that affect hundreds of lives, yet never forgetting his position or his God. But prosperity brings temptation, wearing the face of beauty. Potiphar's wife notices the handsome young Hebrew, sees how he carries himself with quiet dignity. Day after day, she watches him work, her desire growing like fire fed by wind. "Lie with me," she whispers when they are alone, her voice honey-sweet with seduction. Joseph's refusal comes swift and firm. "Look, my master has entrusted everything he owns to my care. He has held nothing back from me except you because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" His words carry the weight of absolute conviction, rooted in loyalty both to his earthly master and his heavenly Father. The woman's desire becomes obsession. Each day, she renews her advances. Each day, Joseph maintains his integrity. He avoids being alone with her when possible, speaks briefly and formally when forced to interact. His righteousness becomes a wall she cannot scale, a fortress she cannot breach. Her longing transforms into rage. The trap closes on an ordinary day when the house lies empty except for Joseph and his master's wife. She catches him by his garment, her grip desperate with frustrated desire. "Come to bed with me," she demands. Joseph tears away from her grasp, leaving his cloak in her hands as he flees toward the door. Sometimes running is the greatest victory. Her screams bring the servants running. "See," she cries, holding the abandoned garment like evidence, "this Hebrew slave has come to make sport of us. He came to me to lie with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." The lie burns in the air like acid. When Potiphar returns, his wife repeats her false accusation with tears and fury. Her husband's face darkens with anger, but Jasher suggests he suspects the truth. The man who trusted Joseph with everything now faces an impossible choice: believe his wife and punish his faithful steward, or protect Joseph and acknowledge his wife's dishonor. The prison gates close behind Joseph with a sound like thunder. The dungeon's darkness swallows him, its dampness seeping into his bones. From household manager to convicted criminal in a single day. Yet even here, in this place of punishment and despair, something divine moves with him. The keeper of the prison soon notices the same qualities Potiphar had seen. "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love," Jasher records. Divine favor follows him even into the depths. The jailer commits all the prisoners to Joseph's care, trusting him with keys and authority. In prison, as in Potiphar's house, everything he touches prospers. Even in bondage, he becomes a leader. Two fellow prisoners arrive with troubled faces and mysterious dreams. Pharaoh's chief baker and butler fall from royal favor, joining Joseph in the darkness of the dungeon. They wake one morning with visions that disturb their sleep and burden their hearts. Joseph sees their distress and offers help with gentle words. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell me your dreams." The butler's dream unfolds like a riddle wrapped in hope. A vine with 3 branches buds and blossoms, bearing grapes that he squeezes into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph's interpretation comes swift and sure. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. You will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his butler. Joseph's plea comes from the heart. "When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." The baker's dream carries darker meanings. 3 baskets of bread for Pharaoh's table, but birds eat from the topmost basket. Joseph's interpretation comes with sorrow. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Both interpretations prove true with frightening accuracy. On the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, the butler returns to his position while the baker meets his doom. Joseph watches the butler leave, hope bright in his chest. Surely now his deliverance will come. Surely the man he helped will remember his kindness. But the butler forgets Joseph as completely as if he had never existed. 2 years pass in the prison's darkness. 2 years of waiting, of hoping, of trusting that God's plan continues even in the depths. Joseph's hair grows longer, his hands rougher, but his faith remains strong. He serves the other prisoners, manages the keeper's affairs, and waits for the dawn he cannot yet see. Jasher teaches us that sometimes God's greatest victories require journeys through the deepest valleys. Joseph's path from favored son to forgotten prisoner seems like a series of disasters, but each step prepares him for purposes beyond his understanding. In Potiphar's house, he learns management. In prison, he learns patience. Both lessons will serve him when the time comes to rule. The dreams that began his troubles still work in the darkness, shaping events he cannot control. His brothers thought they destroyed his future, but they only redirected it toward a destiny none of them could imagine. In Egypt's shadow, the dreamer becomes something greater than he ever dreamed. His true test is not prosperity, but perseverance. Not success, but faithfulness in the depths. The famine and family reunion. 7 years of plenty bless Egypt like a golden river overflowing its banks. Joseph, now elevated to Pharaoh's right hand, moves through the land with the authority of a king. Grain fills the storehouses until they burst, surplus piled high as mountains. The Hebrew slave who interpreted dreams now wears royal linen and rides in Pharaoh's second chariot. Around his neck hangs a golden chain, symbol of power, second only to the throne itself. The book of Jasher tells us Joseph never forgets his origins during these prosperous years. He marries Asenath, daughter of an Egyptian priest, and she bears him 2 sons. The first he names Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second he calls Ephraim, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Yet the names themselves reveal that forgetting is incomplete. Memory lingers like shadows at noon. Then the years of famine begin, creeping across the land like a slow-burning fire. The Nile fails to flood, its waters running low between cracked banks. Crops wither in fields that once waved green with abundance. From Egypt's borders to distant lands, hunger spreads its wings over a world grown desperate for bread. People come to Joseph from every nation, silver in their hands, hope in their hearts. He opens the storehouses with careful wisdom, selling grain but not exhausting supplies. The man who once wore chains now holds the fate of nations in his decisions. Each transaction, each distribution, each choice to sell or withhold shapes the survival of countless families. In Canaan, the famine bites deep into Jacob's household. The old man watches his flocks grow thin, sees his servants' children crying from hunger. News reaches them that grain can be bought in Egypt, that the land of Pharaoh still has bread to sell. Jacob calls his sons together, his voice heavy with the weight of hard choices. "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt," he tells them. "Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." 10 sons prepare for the journey, but Benjamin stays behind. Jacob cannot bear to risk Rachel's other son, his heart still broken from Joseph's supposed death 20 years before. The brothers travel the ancient roads their grandfather Abraham once walked, but now they go as suppliants rather than sojourners. Egypt looms before them like a golden mirage, promising life in a world where death stalks every household. They carry silver and hope in equal measure, not knowing they journey toward a confrontation with their own past. Joseph recognizes them the moment they enter his presence. 20 years have changed their faces, added gray to their beards, bent their backs with labor and worry. But he knows them as surely as he knows his own reflection. They prostrate themselves before him, faces to the ground, and his ancient dreams unfold in living fulfillment. The sheaves and stars bow down as heaven foretold. They do not recognize him. The 17-year-old boy they sold into slavery has become a powerful man of 37, his Hebrew features hidden beneath Egyptian cosmetics, his native tongue replaced by the language of Pharaoh's court. He speaks to them through an interpreter, his voice carefully controlled, his face a mask of official indifference. "Where do you come from?" he asks, though he knows the answer. "From the land of Canaan," they reply, "to buy food." Simple words that carry the weight of their desperation. They have come to the land where they sent their brother, seeking life from the one they tried to destroy. Joseph's accusations fall like hammer blows. "You are spies," he declares. "You have come to see where our land is unprotected." Their protests sound desperate in the great hall. "No, my lord," they cry. "We are honest men, 12 brothers, sons of one man in Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." The phrase cuts through Joseph's composure like a sword. One is no more. They speak of him as dead, these brothers who sold him for silver. Yet here he stands before them, holder of their lives in his hands, master of their fate. The irony tastes bitter on his tongue. He imprisons them for 3 days, letting them taste the fear he once knew in Potiphar's dungeon. When he releases them, his conditions are harsh. One brother must remain as hostage while the others return to Canaan. They must bring their youngest brother back to Egypt to prove their honesty. Only then will their captive brother be freed. The brothers speak among themselves in Hebrew, thinking their words are safe from Egyptian ears. "Surely we are being punished because of our brother," they say. "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." Reuben's voice carries old guilt. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. Joseph turns away to weep, his composure finally cracking under the weight of memory and recognition. They remember. They know their guilt. The years have not erased the echo of his cries from that ancient pit. He washes his face and returns to them, selecting Simeon for imprisonment. As his guards bind the second-born son, Joseph sees in his brothers' faces the same helplessness he once felt. They load their donkeys with grain, but Joseph secretly orders their silver returned to their sacks. When they discover the money during their journey home, terror fills their hearts. "What is this that God has done to us?" they whisper. Divine justice seems to pursue them with supernatural persistence. Jacob's grief explodes when they tell him of Egypt's demands. "You have deprived me of my children," he cries. "Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." His refusal rings absolute until hunger forces his hand. The grain runs out and death stalks their household once more. Judah steps forward with a guarantee that pierces his father's resistance. "I myself will guarantee his safety," he promises. "If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." The man who once suggested selling Joseph now stakes his honor on protecting Benjamin. They return to Egypt with trembling hearts, bringing Benjamin and double silver. Joseph sees his full brother and nearly weeps again. The boy has grown into a man, but his face still carries their mother Rachel's gentle beauty. "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" Joseph asks, his voice carefully controlled. "God be gracious to you, my son." The feast Joseph prepares for them unfolds like a dream within a dream. They sit in order of their ages, their amazement growing as the impossible accuracy becomes clear. How can this Egyptian know their birth order? What power does he possess that reveals family secrets? Benjamin receives 5 times as much food as the others, another test in a series of divine examinations. As they prepare to leave the next morning, Joseph sets his final trap. His silver cup, the one he uses for divination, goes into Benjamin's sack along with the purchased grain. They barely clear the city gates before his steward overtakes them with accusations of theft. Their protests die when the cup emerges from Benjamin's belongings like evidence of betrayal. Back in Joseph's presence, they fall prostrate once more. Judah's plea rises from the depths of a transformed heart. "What can we say to my lord?" he asks. "How can we prove our innocence? God has uncovered your servant's guilt." He offers their freedom for slavery, but Joseph's response cuts deeper than any sword. "Only the man who was found to have the cup will become my slave." Joseph declares, "The rest of you go back to your father in peace." The words hang in the air like a death sentence. Benjamin enslaved in Egypt while they return to face their father's final grief. Then Judah speaks words that reshape the future. He approaches Joseph despite the guards, despite the danger, despite his own fear. "Please let your servant speak a word to my lord," he begins, and tells the story of their father's love for Benjamin, of his grief for Joseph, of his heart that cannot survive another loss. "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers." The offer breaks Joseph's control completely. This is the same Judah who suggested selling him for silver, now willing to sacrifice his own freedom for their youngest brother. He orders all his attendants to leave, and in the sudden silence reveals himself to the brothers who shattered his youth. "I am Joseph," he cries, and the words echo through the hall like thunder. "Is my father still living?" But his brothers cannot answer. Terror holds their tongues as they stare at the brother they betrayed, now master of their fate, holder of their lives, the one who stands between them and starvation. Joseph weeps so loudly that the Egyptians in the next room hear his sobs. 20 years of hidden grief pour out in a torrent of tears. "Come close to me," he tells his terrified brothers. "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Forgiveness flows like healing water over wounds that have festered for decades. Joseph embraces each brother, kissing them with the love that slavery could not destroy. The reconciliation Jacob dreamed of but never expected unfolds in Pharaoh's palace, orchestrated by the God who writes straight with crooked lines. The invitation that follows changes everything. Joseph's family will come to Egypt, settle in the choice land of Goshen, survive the remaining years of famine under his protection. What began as a desperate search for grain becomes the foundation for Israel's 400-year sojourn in a foreign land. The brothers who once scattered in different directions now unite around the miracle of restoration. Jasher reminds us that God's purposes often hide behind human pain. What looked like the destruction of Joseph's dreams was actually their fulfillment in ways no one could have imagined. The brothers' evil intent became the instrument of national preservation. The dreamer's suffering prepared him to save not just his family, but countless others from starvation's grip. The reunion echoes through time as a testament to divine orchestration and human transformation. Hearts hardened by jealousy learn to love. Guilt, carried for decades, finds healing in forgiveness. A family torn apart by favoritism and deception discovers unity in the recognition that God's hand guides even their darkest choices toward purposes beyond their understanding. The Exodus begins. Old age settles over Jacob like a gentle evening, his strength ebbing like a river flowing toward the sea. The years in Egypt have been kind to his family. They multiply like stars in a clear sky, growing from 70 souls to a multitude that fills the land of Goshen. Joseph's wisdom guides Pharaoh's kingdom through the final years of famine, and when abundance returns, Israel's children prosper in their adopted homeland. The book of Jasher tells us Jacob calls his sons to his bedside when he feels death approaching. His voice carries the weight of prophecy as he speaks blessings over each one, words that will shape tribal destinies for generations to come. To Judah, he gives the promise of kingship. To Joseph, the double portion of the firstborn. Each blessing flows from a heart that has wrestled with God and men, emerging transformed by divine grace. Joseph weeps as his father's spirit departs, his sobs echoing through the palace corridors. The man who once saved Egypt from starvation now grieves like any son who loses his father. He orders the royal embalmers to preserve Jacob's body with the skill reserved for pharaohs, honoring the patriarch who became father to a nation. The funeral procession that carries Jacob back to Canaan resembles the march of a conquering army. Pharaoh's officials join the mourning family, their presence testimony to the respect Israel's children have earned in Egypt. They bury the patriarch in the cave of Machpelah beside Abraham and Isaac, linking past promises to future fulfillment. Joseph lives to see his great-great-grandchildren, his days stretching like a bridge between the patriarchal age and the coming Exodus. Before his death, he speaks words that echo through the generations. God will surely come to your aid, he tells his gathered family, and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His bones wait in their coffin for that future day of deliverance. Years flow like water, carrying away the generation that knew Joseph's kindness. A new pharaoh rises, who never heard the stories of how a Hebrew slave saved Egypt from starvation. He sees only the growing multitude of foreign people in his land, their numbers expanding like floodwaters, their strength becoming a concern that troubles his sleep. Look, he tells his advisors, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Fear transforms gratitude into suspicion, blessing into threat. The oppression begins slowly, like darkness creeping across a sunset sky. Taskmasters appear over the Hebrew workers, their whips speaking a new language of bondage. The people who once lived as honored guests now labor as reluctant slaves, building treasure cities for a pharaoh who sees them only as threats to be controlled. Pithom and Ramesses rise from their sweat and tears, massive construction projects that consume Hebrew lives like hungry flames. Yet the harder the Egyptians work them, the more the Israelites multiply. Their increase becomes supernatural, as if oppression only waters the seeds of divine promise planted in their hearts. Pharaoh's frustration grows into paranoid fury. He summons the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, women whose hands have delivered thousands of Hebrew babies. When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth, he commands, Look at the delivery stool. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But the midwives fear God more than they fear Pharaoh. They deliver the boys safely, hiding their disobedience behind clever words. Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, they tell the king. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Their courage preserves a generation of future deliverers. The order that follows chills every Hebrew heart. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, Pharaoh declares, but let every girl live. The river that once brought prosperity to Egypt becomes a graveyard for Hebrew dreams. Mothers weep as they hide their sons or watch the current carry away their hopes. In this darkest hour, a Levite woman gives birth to a son whose destiny will reshape the world. She hides him for 3 months, her heart breaking each time he cries. When concealment becomes impossible, she weaves a basket of papyrus reeds, waterproofs it with tar and pitch, and places her baby among the reeds along the Nile's bank. His sister Miriam watches from a distance as Pharaoh's daughter comes to bathe. The princess finds the basket, opens it, and her heart melts at the sight of the crying child. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she whispers. But instead of following her father's decree, she chooses compassion over law. Miriam steps forward with the courage of youth. "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she offers. The princess agrees, and the girl runs to fetch their mother. The woman who thought she had lost her son forever now receives wages for nursing him back to health. The child grows up in Pharaoh's palace with the name Moses, meaning drawn out of the water. He learns Egyptian wisdom, masters their language, studies their military arts. Yet something in his heart remembers his Hebrew heritage, the cries of his oppressed people, the God of his fathers who promised deliverance. His privileged position crumbles the day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Rage fills his heart like fire, and he strikes down the oppressor, burying the body in the sand. When word of his deed spreads, he flees into the wilderness, leaving behind palace luxury for desert exile. In Midian, Moses finds peace among the flocks of Jethro, marrying Zipporah and learning the patient ways of a shepherd. 40 years pass in the wilderness, polishing away his Egyptian pride, teaching him humility in preparation for the greatest task any man has ever faced. The prince who thought he could save his people through violence becomes the shepherd who will lead them through faith. Meanwhile, the oppression in Egypt deepens like shadows at evening. The Pharaoh who issued the murderous decree dies, but his successor proves no kinder to Hebrew suffering. Their groaning rises to heaven like incense, their cries echoing in the chambers of divine justice. The time of silence nears its end. God hears their groaning and remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises made to the patriarchs stir like seeds after winter, ready to burst into bloom. The stage is set for the greatest rescue in human history, the deliverance that will make Egypt's gods look powerless and Israel's God appear supreme. Jasher reminds us that some deliverances require long preparation. 400 years of bondage seem cruel, but they forge a people who know their need for divine help. Moses' 80 years of preparation seem excessive, but they create a leader humble enough to follow God's voice. The darkest hour often comes just before the dawn, when hope seems dead, but redemption waits in the wings. The baby in the basket grows into the man who will part seas and speak with God face to face. The Hebrew slaves who cry out in desperation will march out as a nation with signs and wonders. The God who seems silent prepares to speak with thunder and lightning, revealing power that will echo through the ages. Moses in Jasher. The burning bush blazes against the Midian sky like a star fallen to earth, its flames dancing without consuming the branches. Moses approaches with a shepherd's caution, his weathered hands gripping his staff, his feet treading on ground suddenly declared holy. The book of Jasher reveals this moment as the hinge of history, where the voice of heaven breaks 400 years of silence with words that will reshape the world. "Moses, Moses." The voice calls from the fire, and he responds with the humility learned through decades of exile. "Here I am." The God of his fathers speaks with authority that makes the mountain tremble, commissioning the shepherd to become deliverer, the exile to return as liberator, the man who fled Egypt to march back with divine mandate. The objections tumble from Moses' lips like water from a broken jar. His speech stumbles, his confidence wavers, his past failures loom large in his memory. Yet God answers each concern with patient power, transforming his staff into a serpent, turning his hand leprous and clean again, promising words that will flow when the moment demands them. Jasher tells us Moses' return to Egypt unfolds with supernatural signs that confirm his calling. The staff that guided sheep now commands creation itself. Waters turn to blood at his word. Frogs respond to his gesture. Gnats swarm at his command. Each plague reveals the impotence of Egypt's gods, the futility of Pharaoh's resistance, the approaching triumph of Israel's God. Yet the most revealing details in Jasher concern not the public miracles, but the private struggles. Moses wrestles with doubt even as he performs wonders. His wife Zipporah questions the dangerous path he has chosen. His brother Aaron sometimes wavers in faith despite witnessing miracles. The man chosen to lead a nation battles the same fears and uncertainties that plague every human heart. The first encounter with Pharaoh demonstrates the collision between earthly and heavenly authority. Moses and Aaron stand before the throne with their simple request. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. The answer comes swift and harsh. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Pharaoh's defiance unleashes the first plague like thunder after lightning. The Nile runs red as blood, its fish dying, its waters undrinkable. Yet the royal magicians duplicate the miracle through their secret arts, hardening their master's heart against surrender. Pride becomes a poison that blinds the king to divine power, even as his kingdom suffers under supernatural judgment. The second plague brings frogs in such multitudes that they fill every corner of Egyptian life. They invade bedrooms and ovens, hop through palace halls and peasant huts. The absurdity of the situation might seem comical if not for its devastating message. The gods of Egypt cannot protect their worshippers from creatures as humble as frogs. Pharaoh calls for Moses when the plague becomes unbearable. Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, he pleads, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. But when relief comes, his promise evaporates like morning mist. The pattern establishes itself. Crisis brings temporary humility. Relief restores stubborn pride. The third plague transforms dust into gnats that swarm over man and beast alike. Even Pharaoh's magicians admit defeat. This is the finger of God, they declare, but their master's heart remains unmoved. The fourth plague sends flies that respect the boundary between Egyptian and Hebrew territory, sparing Goshen while tormenting the rest of the land. Jasher reveals the growing tension within Pharaoh's court as the plagues multiply. Advisors urge compromise while the king insists on absolute control. How long will this man be a snare to us? They ask. Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? Yet pride proves stronger than wisdom, stubbornness more powerful than reason. The fifth plague strikes the livestock, killing cattle and horses, sheep and goats throughout Egypt, while sparing every animal in Goshen. The economic devastation compounds the supernatural humiliation. Egypt's wealth bleeds away like water through a broken vessel. Yet Pharaoh refuses to acknowledge the hand that holds his kingdom's fate. The sixth plague brings boils that torment flesh with fiery pain. The magicians who once challenged Moses' power now cannot even stand in his presence, their bodies covered with the same affliction that strikes all Egypt. The seventh plague hurls hail mixed with fire, destroying crops and trees, killing anyone caught outdoors during the supernatural storm. Moses' intercession after each plague reveals his heart for mercy even toward his enemies. He prays for Egypt's relief, not from hatred, but from love, demonstrating the difference between God's justice and human revenge. The man who could demand immediate liberation instead shows patience that mirrors divine character. The eighth plague darkens the sky with locusts that devour every green thing the hail spared. Egypt's agricultural wealth disappears into countless hungry mouths, leaving the land barren as a desert. The ninth plague wraps the country in darkness so thick it can be felt. 3 days of supernatural night that leaves Egyptians groping like blind men, while Hebrews enjoy normal light in their homes. Each plague chips away at Pharaoh's resistance while revealing his character's true nature. Temporary concessions give way to renewed defiance. Partial agreements dissolve into complete refusal. The man who could have ended his nation's suffering with a word instead chooses to amplify it through stubborn pride. Moses ages during these confrontations, his hair whiter, his face more lined, his voice carrying the weight of prophetic authority. Leading a nation proves harder than leading sheep. Dealing with divine power demands more strength than managing flocks. The man grows into his calling through trial and testing, each encounter with Pharaoh preparing him for greater challenges ahead. The final warning comes with solemn gravity. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die. Moses declares, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the female slave who is at her hand mill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. Yet even in announcing judgment, Moses provides escape through the Passover lamb. Blood on doorposts will mark Hebrew homes for divine protection. Death will pass over those who trust God's provision while striking those who reject his mercy. The final plague will break Pharaoh's will while demonstrating that God takes no pleasure in destruction, offering salvation even to his enemies. Jasher shows us Moses as more than miracle worker or liberation leader. He becomes the bridge between divine purpose and human weakness, the translator who makes God's will comprehensible to fearful hearts. His stammering speech finds perfect words when heaven's message needs earthly voice. His reluctant leadership grows into confident authority through divine empowerment. The confrontation with Pharaoh transforms Moses from exile to prophet, from shepherd to nation builder, from uncertain servant to confident commander. Each plague teaches him more about God's character. Each negotiation develops his diplomatic skills. Each miracle strengthens his faith for the greater tests awaiting in the wilderness. The man who once fled Egypt as a fugitive will soon lead 2 million people out as their divinely appointed deliverer. The baby rescued from the Nile grows into the leader who will part the Red Sea. The prince who lost his throne becomes the lawgiver who will receive commandments written by God's own finger. Divine preparation proves perfect in its timing and complete in its scope. The plagues and the Exodus. The midnight hour approaches Egypt like a shadow with wings, carrying with it the weight of divine judgment too long delayed. Throughout the land, Hebrew families gather behind doors marked with lamb's blood, their hearts pounding with mixture of fear and faith. The book of Jasher tells us they eat their final meal in Egypt with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands, ready to flee the only home most have ever known. Death moves through Egypt's streets with silent precision, entering every house unmarked by blood. From Pharaoh's palace to the humblest servant's hut, the angel of destruction claims its tribute. Firstborn sons who fell asleep expecting another ordinary dawn awaken instead in eternity. The cry that rises from Egyptian homes tears the night like fabric, a wailing that makes the earth itself seem to mourn. Pharaoh's own son lies still in the royal chambers, the heir to Egypt's throne now beyond earthly crowns. The king who declared himself divine discovers his powerlessness against the god of slaves. His grief explodes into desperate surrender. He summons Moses and Aaron in the darkness, his voice breaking with emotion too raw for royal composure. Up! Leave my people, you and the Israelites, he cries. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said and go, and also bless me. The man who once claimed not to know Israel's God now begs for blessing from the servants he tried to destroy. The Egyptians press gifts upon their departing Hebrew neighbors with hands that shake from loss and fear. Gold and silver, clothing and precious stones pour into Hebrew bags like water from broken dams. The plundered wealth of 4 centuries of bondage changes hands in a single night, voluntary tribute from a people desperate to speed their former slaves. Departure. 600,000 Hebrew men march out of Egypt with their families, a multitude so vast it stretches beyond sight. Mixed among them walk others who have chosen to cast their lot with Israel's God, Egyptians and foreigners, who witnessed the plagues and decided to follow the people whose divine protection proved stronger than Pharaoh's rage. They take with them Joseph's bones, honoring the promise made centuries before when the dying patriarch spoke of their eventual departure. The coffin travels among them like a banner of fulfilled prophecy, connecting their present deliverance to ancient hopes. What began as one man's dream of reunion becomes a nation's march toward destiny. God leads them not by the shorter coastal road, but through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. The pillar of cloud by day and fire by night guides their steps, visible proof of divine presence among them. This supernatural GPS never fails, never misleads, never abandons them, even when the path seems to lead toward impossible obstacles. Behind them, Pharaoh's heart hardens once more, like metal cooling after fire. What have we done? He asks his advisors. We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. Grief transforms into rage, regret into determination to reclaim what he considers his property. Pride proves stronger than wisdom, even after devastating loss. The Egyptian army mobilizes with swift efficiency. 600 select chariots lead the charge, followed by all the other chariots in Egypt, their wheels thundering across the desert like approaching storm. Pharaoh himself commands the pursuit, his heart set on dragging his former slaves back to bondage. Israel camps beside the Red Sea, apparently trapped between water and approaching army. The sea stretches before them like an impassable barrier, its waters deep and wide, its currents strong enough to swallow a nation. Behind them, dust clouds announce Pharaoh's approach, with the promise of death or recapture for those who dared to dream of freedom. Terror grips the Hebrew multitude like fever. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? They cry to Moses. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Moses stands between his people's panic and Pharaoh's pursuit, his faith tested by circumstances that seem to mock divine promises. Yet his voice carries calm certainty when he addresses their fears. Do not be afraid, he declares. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. God's instruction comes with dramatic simplicity. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. The man who once protested his inadequacy now wields power that commands creation itself. His staff, carved from ordinary wood, becomes the instrument of supernatural deliverance. The angel of God moves from leading Israel's march to guarding their rear, positioning himself between the fleeing slaves and pursuing army. The pillar of cloud brings darkness to the Egyptians while providing light to the Hebrews, creating a supernatural barrier that prevents night attack. Heaven itself takes sides in this cosmic confrontation between freedom and oppression. Moses stretches his hand over the sea, and waters that have flowed together since creation separate like curtains drawn by invisible hands. The seabed appears, dry as desert ground, walls of water standing firm on either side. Physics bows to divine command as the impossible becomes the pathway of liberation. The Hebrews march through the sea with trembling hearts and wondering eyes, their feet finding solid ground where waves should have swallowed them. Children who hours before cried in terror now laugh at fish swimming in the crystal walls beside them. The elderly who thought they would die in bondage walk toward freedom on the floor of the sea. Pharaoh's army follows with the confidence of those who mistake divine patience for divine weakness. Chariots race down the same dry path their prey has taken, wheels spinning over sand that should have been submerged beneath fathoms. The pursuit that began in rage continues in the very miracle meant to demonstrate God's power. But the Lord fights against Egypt with confusion and terror. Chariot wheels stick in the mud as the seafloor becomes treacherous. Horses rear and refuse to advance. Soldiers cry out in sudden understanding. Let us get away from the Israelites, they shout. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Recognition comes too late for escape. Moses stretches his hand over the sea once more, and the walls of water collapse with thunderous roar. The sea returns to its place with force that shakes the earth, sweeping away the flower of Egypt's military might. Pharaoh's chariots disappear beneath waves that show no trace of their passage. The army that pursued in pride drowns in the justice of the God they defied. Israel watches from the far shore as bodies wash up on the beach, evidence of deliverance too complete for doubt. The sea that seemed an obstacle becomes their salvation. The impossible barrier transforms into the path of freedom. They pick up Egyptian weapons from the shore, spoils of a victory won without human fighting. Miriam takes up her tambourine and leads the women in a song that echoes across the waters. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted, she cries. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The music rises like incense, celebration mixed with reverence for the God who saves his people through mighty acts. The Exodus becomes the defining moment of Hebrew identity, the birth certificate of Israel as a nation. Every subsequent generation will remember this night when death passed over their houses and this day when God divided the sea. The slaves who shuffled under Egyptian whips now march as free people toward a promised land. Jasher reminds us that some deliverances require divine intervention beyond human capability. No amount of planning or preparation could have freed 2 million slaves from the world's greatest empire. No human strategy could have parted the Red Sea or destroyed Pharaoh's army. Some victories belong entirely to God, achieved through power that makes human strength look like children's games. The blood on the doorpost speaks of protection through sacrifice. The path through the sea demonstrates salvation through divine power. The destruction of Pharaoh's army reveals justice that catches up with oppression. These themes will echo through scripture and history, reminders that the God who delivered Israel from Egypt still works to free those who cry out for liberation. The people who entered Egypt as a family of 70 emerge as a nation of millions, shaped by suffering but sustained by faith. Their journey towards Sinai begins with this supernatural rescue, this demonstration that their God reigns supreme over all the powers of earth. The Exodus becomes the foundation story that defines their identity and shapes their destiny for all generations to come, the book's legacy. The ancient scroll closes with mysteries still wrapped around its words like morning mist around mountain peaks. The book of Jasher settles into history's quiet corners, its stories echoing through centuries, while scholars debate its origins and believers ponder its meanings. What began as whispered tales around Hebrew campfires has grown into something larger, touching hearts and minds across cultures and ages. Its influence spreads like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Medieval rabbis quote its passages in their commentaries, finding in its expanded narratives explanations for biblical puzzles that had long troubled faithful hearts. The additional details about Abraham's youth, the deeper glimpses into Joseph's character, the fuller account of Moses' preparation. These elements fill gaps that canonical scripture leaves open to imagination. Christian scholars approach the book with mixture of fascination and caution, drawn by its vivid storytelling, yet mindful of its uncertain origins. Some embrace it as valuable historical background that illuminates biblical events. Others maintain careful distance, preferring the certainty of canonical texts to the questions surrounding Jasher's authenticity. The debates themselves become part of the book's legacy. Seminary classrooms buzz with discussions about pseudepigraphic literature, the role of tradition in preserving ancient stories, the difference between historical fact and spiritual truth. Students grapple with questions that have no easy answers. Can a text carry divine wisdom, even if its authorship remains uncertain? Does spiritual value depend on historical accuracy? Mormon communities find particular resonance in Jasher's narratives, their leaders sometimes citing its passages alongside biblical texts. The book's expanded accounts of patriarchal stories align with their emphasis on continuing revelation and additional scripture. Yet even within these circles, careful readers distinguish between inspiration and canonization, between useful commentary and authoritative doctrine. Jewish communities maintain varied relationships with the text. Orthodox scholars often treat it as midrash, interpretive tradition that illuminates scripture without claiming equal authority. Reform and conservative readers may appreciate its literary value while remaining skeptical about its historical claims. The book occupies a unique space in Jewish thought, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected. Academic circles approach Jasher with the tools of literary criticism and historical analysis. Scholars dissect its language, trace its possible sources, compare its narratives to other ancient texts. The question of whether this represents the actual lost book mentioned in Scripture remains hotly debated. Most conclude that the current text, whatever its merits, cannot be the original work referenced by Joshua and Samuel. Yet the academic skepticism cannot diminish the book's emotional impact on readers who encounter its stories. The account of Abraham's youth resonates with those struggling against cultural conformity. Joseph's patient endurance during imprisonment speaks to hearts acquainted with unjust suffering. Moses' reluctant leadership encourages those thrust into positions they never sought. The book's narrative style itself influences later storytelling traditions. Its technique of expanding biblical episodes with psychological detail and dramatic dialogue becomes a model for historical fiction writers. Authors discover how to fill scriptural gaps without contradicting canonical accounts, how to imagine the inner lives of biblical characters while respecting their essential nature. Modern publishers find steady demand for Jasher editions, suggesting its continued relevance to contemporary readers. Some approach it as historical document, others as spiritual meditation, still others as literary curiosity. The various motivations for reading create different interpretive communities, each finding in the text what their particular interests lead them to seek. The internet age brings new life to ancient debates about Jasher's authenticity. Online forums buzz with arguments about textual evidence, historical parallels, linguistic analysis. Amateur researchers publish detailed theories about the book's origins, while professional scholars maintain their measured skepticism. The democratization of biblical research allows ordinary readers to engage with questions once confined to academic institutions. Translation projects multiply as different groups seek to make Jasher accessible to modern audiences. Each translation reflects the translator's assumptions about the text's nature and purpose. Some emphasize literal accuracy while others prioritize readability. The variations reveal how translation itself becomes interpretation, shaping how readers understand the book's messages. Archaeological discoveries occasionally reignite interest in Jasher's historical claims. When excavations uncover details that align with the book's narratives, supporters cite these findings as vindication. When archaeological evidence contradicts Jasher's accounts, critics point to these discrepancies as proof of the text's legendary nature. The ongoing dialogue between text and artifact keeps the book's status perpetually unsettled. Religious education programs face practical decisions about including Jasher in their curricula. Some embrace it as valuable background material that enriches biblical understanding. Others exclude it entirely, preferring to focus on canonical texts. Many choose a middle path, presenting the book as interesting tradition while clearly distinguishing it from authoritative scripture. The book's treatment of women characters draws particular attention in contemporary discussions. Jasher provides more detailed portraits of female figures than the biblical accounts, sometimes portraying them as active agents in shaping events. Feminist scholars appreciate these expanded roles while remaining cautious about accepting anachronistic interpretations of ancient texts. Children's adaptations of Jasher stories appear regularly, suggesting the book's enduring appeal for younger audiences. The vivid narratives of Abraham's youth, Joseph's dreams, and Moses' calling translate well into illustrated formats. Parents and educators value stories that expand biblical knowledge while maintaining moral clarity. Literary scholars study Jasher as an example of how communities preserve and transform their foundational narratives. The text demonstrates the fluid boundary between history and legend, showing how stories evolve as they pass through generations. Each retelling adapts ancient events to contemporary concerns while claiming fidelity to original truth. The question of Jasher's ultimate value may depend less on resolving debates about its authenticity than on recognizing its role in ongoing conversations about faith, history, and interpretation. The book serves as a mirror reflecting the concerns and assumptions of its readers across centuries. What people see in Jasher often reveals more about their own perspectives than about ancient events. Some readers find in the book confirmation of their existing beliefs about biblical characters and events. Others discover challenges to their assumptions, encountering familiar figures from unexpected angles. The text's ability to surprise even careful readers suggests depths that purely historical or purely fictional works rarely achieve. The book's legacy may ultimately rest not in settling questions about its origins, but in demonstrating the power of narrative to shape understanding. Whether ancient or medieval, authentic or pseudepigraphic, Jasher shows how stories function to preserve memory, transmit values, and inspire imagination. Its continued readership across diverse communities testifies to something enduring in its appeal. Future generations will likely continue debating Jasher's place in biblical literature, its relationship to canonical texts, its value for understanding ancient Jewish thought. These ongoing discussions ensure the book's relevance even as they prevent final resolution of its status. Perhaps the questions Jasher raises matter more than the answers it provides. The scroll that claims to record ancient wisdom remains a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, carried forward by readers who find in its pages something worth preserving. Whether that something represents historical truth, spiritual insight, literary artistry, or cultural memory may matter less than the simple fact that people continue turning its pages, seeking in its stories light for their own journeys. The Book of Jasher endures as testament to humanity's hunger for the stories behind the stories, the details that make ancient figures feel human, the bridges that connect past and present through shared struggles and hopes. In an age of skepticism about religious claims and historical narratives, the book maintains its appeal by offering not dogma but story, not certainty but possibility. Its legacy lives in the conversations it generates, the imaginations it fires, the questions it raises about how we know what we know and how we decide what matters. The ancient text continues its journey through time, carried by readers who may disagree about its origins, but share appreciation for its enduring power to illuminate the timeless themes of faith, family, forgiveness, and divine purpose, working through human frailty. Perhaps this is legacy enough to survive across centuries, not because scholars can prove its claims, but because ordinary people find in its narratives echoes of their own hopes for meaning, redemption, and the possibility that their stories too might be part of something larger than themselves. The Book of Jasher remains what it has always been, a mirror in which readers see reflected their deepest longings for connection to the divine drama that gives life its ultimate significance.